Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm Yann Duval. I'm the Acting Director of the Trade, Investment and Innovation Division at the UN ESCAP, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this regional consultation. I think we're going to get started with the opening session in just a few minutes. Just a few words on my end. First, I'm very happy to report that we have about 30 country delegations joining the regional consultation, as well as about 40 representatives from think tanks and civil society. So I hope the discussions will be interesting and active and fruitful during the entire regional consultation. So as you know, there is 3 afternoon segments for the regional consultation, right? From one this afternoon, another one tomorrow, another one on 9 September. And then there will be a 4th afternoon segment dedicated to capacity building. So during that capacity building segment on 10 of September, what we will do is we go over some of the ESCAP tools and program related to the topic of the regional consultation, which is harnessing trade for faster recovery and sustainable development. So I think many of you have been nominated to attend 7, 8, 9 September session, but you're all very welcome to also attend this capacity building segment on 10 September. Because there is, I think, an increasing number of online tools in particular that are being made available by ESCAP, but also by the UN system that can really help with your work, right? Trade negotiation, trade policy design, and so on. So for this afternoon, what will happen? We'll have a short opening segment, and then WTO will provide a state of play, status of affairs, right, in preparation of MC12 of the Ministerial Conference, and then we'll have 2 substantive sessions. One on health and trade, and one on fishery subsidies and agriculture. So I would like to thank the moderators and all the experts that are going to present and the topics of the 2 sessions. So with no further ado, I think let's begin the opening session. And maybe let me request, because I hear some sound, background sound, right? So all the people who are not speaking, please switch off your microphone at this stage. And then let's move forward with the opening and the welcome remarks by Ibu Armida Salsaya Al-Sijabana, with the Executive Secretary of UN ESCAP. Thank you.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this regional consultation on harnessing trade for faster recovery and sustainable development in preparation for the 12th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization, or WTO MC12. The COVID-19 pandemic has heavily disrupted the existing regional and global supply chain in goods and services. But more importantly, countries in Asia and Pacific have seen a reversal of their earlier socio-economic gains and progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. The region was already falling short of its 2020 SDG milestones before the pandemic. With the pandemic, we find that the region may now achieve less than 10% of the SDG targets. Therefore, it is key that policy responses support progress towards SDGs to the maximum extent possible. This is no easy task and will require resources, including from a dynamic and sustainable trade environment. Effective participation in the multilateral trading system has been acknowledged as the first best approach to secure stable market access across the globe. In principle, it provides a universal system of enforceable rules to balance stability and efficiency of international trade transactions. The primacy of multilateral trade governance under the WTO has been weaved into the design of the SDGs. However, we are all aware that the global framework for rules-based trade, which also underpins many regional trade arrangements, is in crisis, with a once strong enforcement mechanism now significantly weakened. Unabated trade tensions among leading trading nations and unchecked protectionism and nationalism in the wake of supply disruptions in the early phase of the COVID-19 pandemic has further worsened economic uncertainty for all and especially for developing and least developed countries. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, the MC12 outcome will have serious consequences for the future of the multilateral trading system and the ability of its members to rely on trade in pursuit of sustainable development. This is especially relevant for the economies of Asia and the Pacific, which have anchored their development on the opening of their economies to international trade and investment. I would like to recall our member states' commitments expressed at the ESCAP Committee on Trade and Investment to open borders and markets and to resist taking protectionist measures. Member states also agreed that promoting trade and investment was the core element of the strategy to recover from the crisis and build back sooner, while considering legitimate public health concerns. With that in mind, I would like to invite delegates to discuss how the multilateral trading regime can support trade and how it can contribute more directly to achieving the SDGs. Let me point to several relevant initiatives and knowledge products of the Secretariat. For example, in collaboration with UNCTAD, WTO, civil society, and many high-level experts, the Secretariat has prepared a handbook on provisions on options in trade agreements for trade in times of crisis and pandemic. Furthermore, our annual Asia-Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021 focuses on climate-smart trade and investment. Our theme study at the 2020 session of the Commission on Oceans also offers constructive ways to improve regional cooperation and address the issues surrounding fisheries subsidies, which will be discussed in this meeting. Lastly, ESCAP Framework Agreement on Cross-Border Paperless Trade Facilitation, which entered into force earlier this year, provides a regional mechanism to support further discussion and implementation of some of the e-commerce related rules discussed at the WTO. I invite all member states to join this agreement as soon as possible. These examples demonstrate ESCAP's continuing readiness to support the Asia-Pacific region in becoming a leader in trade-led sustainable development. I wish you all a fruitful discussion during the coming session. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Ibu Amida, for the welcoming remarks. In principle, we have now a statement from Mrs. Kusukova Sabriovna, who is the Vice Minister of Trade and Integration of Kazakhstan, right? Because Kazakhstan is co-hosting the WTO Minister Conference at the end of the year. Unfortunately, she informed us that she had an impeachment, so she could not deliver the speech by herself. Let me ask if there is anyone from the Kazakhstan delegation who is able to deliver a speech before I move on with the opening session. Please. Kazakhstan delegation, if you could take the floor to let us know.
Can you hear us?
Yes, very well.
Thank you. Dear participants and ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Ministry of Trade and Integration of the Republic of Kazakhstan, let me welcome you on today's event and let me thank the organizers of these consultations, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, for invitation to speak today. Today, we are going to witness and participate the very important discussions on harnessing trade for faster recovery and sustainable development. Right ahead of the upcoming key event in the field of international trade, the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference. Kazakhstan has the honor and great responsibility to act as the chair of the MC12. For more than 25 years, the WTO has been a key pillar of global economic governance and an effective tool for inclusive growth and sustainable development. The rule-based trading system created by the WTO has also become an important basis on which all companies rely when conducting international business and has created the necessary predictable legal framework. Now that the WTO is facing numerous challenges, it is the turn of the business community to help the organization justify the economic feasibility of rules-based trading system, encourage governments to resolve differences and make progress on key issues that threaten the system, and identify issues and opportunities where the WTO can serve as a forum to support trade-related economic growth. It is crucial that governments and the business community continue to cooperate, develop public-private partnership in the multilateral trading system and hear each other's voices. The WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference is going to take place at unprecedented times. The coronavirus pandemic has led to a large number of human casualties and caused a global recession. The WTO member countries are in favor of reforming the organization to strengthen its ability to respond to the current situation. In our opinion, an important I lost connection.
We have lost connection, yes, but you can continue if you got it back.
Yeah, so let me continue. The WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference is going to take place at unprecedented times. The coronavirus pandemic has led to a large number of human casualties and caused a global recession. The WTO member countries are in favor of reforming the organization to strengthen its ability to respond to the current situation. In our opinion, an important issue is preserving the relevance of the WTO for the business community. Today's consultations demonstrate the importance of ongoing problems of international trade and upcoming discussions on seeking possible solutions for its rule-based multilateral approach to trade. I hope that the participants of today's consultations will be able to comprehensively discuss the prospects and opportunities of the world trade, as well as such important issues as the strengthening the role of the trade and in sustainable development, viability of WTO negotiation function, WTO reform, and its dispute settlement mechanism problems. I wish you successful consultations.
Thank you very much. If it's possible, we'd like to have a copy of the speech so we can make it available to the participants. This is very useful and appreciated. Let me move to the last part of the opening segment, and maybe also the beginning of the next segment, right? Because WTO Secretariat, represented by Annabelle Gonzalez, is going to provide us with opening remarks and also give us a state of play in terms of the preparation of the ministerial conference. So Annabelle, we're always very happy to have you and benefit from your expertise. I'm happy to give you the floor. I've seen your name, so I think you're here.
Thank you very much, Jan. I'm delighted to be here. Madam Executive Secretary, Excellencies, dear colleagues, thank you very much for inviting me to this regional consultation in preparation for the WTO 12 Ministerial Conference. For the past 70 years, global trade has been governed by a set of rules centered on non-discrimination, transparency, and binding and enforceable commitments on tariff and other policy instruments, which have brought greater certainty and increased market openness. Throughout this period, an increasingly global framework of trade rules has helped create an unprecedented extent of global prosperity, helping to raise living standards around the world. Many countries have shared into this prosperity, as have many people, particularly in this part of the world. The high point of global governance was reached in mid-1990s with the creation of the WTO, where countries committed not just to an expanded and improved GATT, but actually to a new era of global economic cooperation. The WTO expanded in number to become a quasi-universal organization, but also in quantitative terms, with the accession of China, Russia, and Vietnam. Today, it covers 98% of trade, and it has enhanced the rule of law in trade relations, with over 500 cases brought to the dispute settlement mechanism and countless additional conflicts prevented. But reaching agreement at the multilateral level has become elusive. There have been some successes, as the expansion of the Information Technology Agreement, the negotiation of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and the elimination of agricultural export subsidies. But clearly, it has not been possible to pursue deeper international cooperation, which has resulted in some very old and also very new issues remaining unaddressed at the global level. Preferential trade agreements have to some extent filled the vacuum, but only partially. Now, beyond the pandemics, from geopolitics to geoeconomics, from climate change to digitalization, from social tensions to increased nationalism, increased risks and challenges will reshape the global trade and investment landscape. A rules-based trading system that provides predictability and certainty with a revitalized WTO at its core will become even more relevant to support countries as they navigate a complex external environment and continue to leverage trade for sustainable and inclusive growth. So the months ahead offer a critical window of opportunity to reinvigorate the WTO. By delivering results between now and our 12th ministerial conference in November, WTO members can break with a recent history of deadlock and give a valuable boost to the global economic recovery. Now, I have been asked to provide some thoughts on the current state of affairs in preparation for MC12, on key recent developments, and on major issues that will be up for consideration by ministers in December. And let me start by commending the ESCAP's Regional Consultation Initiative, the variety and pertinence of the topics covered during this event, the quality of the speakers that will intervene, and the participants provide a great opportunity for Asian and Pacific countries to contribute to capacity building in the region. I also want to thank the participating Asia Pacific members for the importance that they attach to enhanced multilateral cooperation, including in the area of trade, and in what has been everyone's main objective this past month, the fight against COVID-19. So addressing the pandemic is an issue of the utmost importance for the entire WTO membership and for our new Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. A collective multilateral WTO-driven response to the pandemic is a moral imperative. We know lives are at stake, but it's also an issue of practical and economic concern. With this objective in mind, discussions at the WTO have been intensifying in the past few months. WTO members have submitted a plethora of communications covering a large breadth of issues and including strategic areas such as export restrictions, trade facilitation, the role of services, transparency and monitoring, cooperation between relevant international organizations and other key stakeholders, as well as a potential framework to respond effectively to future pandemics or other crises. Regarding the transfer of technology, know-how, and intellectual property, including the waiver of the trade-related intellectual property agreement, these discussions are also ongoing within the TRIPS Council, where WTO members have recently started text-based negotiations. In particular, I wish to briefly touch upon the crucial issue of equitable access to vaccines, which ought to be tackled. We know that trade is key in efforts to scale up vaccine production and distribution. That is why the WTO has partnered with the WHO, the IMF, and the World Bank in a multilateral leaders task force on COVID-19 to track, coordinate, and advance delivery of COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. The objective is to work with governments and partners at the global and local level to address finance and trade barriers to ensure that vulnerable populations have access to these life-saving tools. There are several actions that WTO members can consider to create a conducive trading environment for vaccine development, such as freeing up vaccine supply chains by facilitating trade and reducing export restrictions, and identifying and addressing supply chain bottlenecks with manufacturers to increase vaccine production and distribution, particularly in developing countries and least developed in particular. By MC12 in December, a framework for COVID-19 and future health crisis could be on the table for consideration by ministers. Should WTO members agree on such a framework this year, whenever the next crisis comes, these debates will not have to be repeated and all of our attention would be aimed at saving lives. Now, there are other areas where action at the WTO is expected at MC12. Concluding the fisheries subsidies negotiation and an outcome on agriculture are at the top of members' priorities. On both fronts, negotiations have been very active, and we very much welcome the efforts that are being made. On fisheries subsidies, the chair of the negotiations introduced a revised draft text in June. And on July 15, 104 ministers came together virtually and provided the political impetus to work on the basis of the chair's draft text and to do what is necessary to advance the negotiations towards the finish line. I am aware that this is a vital issue for ESCAP members, and in particular, small island developing states of the Asia-Pacific region. We remain positive. I believe in particular that we are moving towards an agreement that would be beneficial for the well-being of our oceans, for the livelihood of fisherwomen and men across the globe, and for public budgets. On agriculture, the chair of the negotiations recently introduced a draft negotiating text aimed at facilitating consensus among members and seeking potential landing zones. The topics under consideration include domestic support, market access, export restrictions, export competition, cotton, public stockholding for food security purposes, a special safeguard mechanism, and transparency as a cross-cutting issue. Hunger and food insecurity have been on the rise as a result of the pandemic. An MC12 package on agriculture could respond to these food security concerns on public stockholding, as well as World Food Program purchases for humanitarian purposes, while also taking steps on transparency and domestic support. Intensive text-based negotiations will begin actually today. And here I wish to highlight that a collective sense of urgency, goodwill, and flexibility will be required to build convergence, to avoid repeating long-standing positions, and to achieve a credible outcome on agriculture and on fisheries, bearing in mind the broader objective of positively impacting people's lives. Now, addressing the appellate body impasse is at the top of members' priorities for MC12. This is well known. And I also know that this is a priority for countries in this part of the world. Members should aim to reach an agreement on the kinds of reforms they wish to realize for the dispute settlement system, so that all pillars of the WTO can work better for member governments and for the people they represent. A post-MC12 work program or roadmap has been suggested as a potential deliverable in December to resolve this underlying issue and restore confidence in a binding, fully functional dispute settlement system at the WTO. But the broader topic of dispute settlement could also be seen in light of the broader discussions on WTO reform, where members have also expressed a certain interest for a ministerial outcome. With this in mind, efforts could be geared towards centralizing the numerous topics, submissions, and proposals that members believe could be encompassed by WTO reform. They could cover issues such as enhancing the WTO's negotiating function, notifications, and monitoring, as well as other potential institutional improvements that could benefit the entire membership and enable the organization to be fit for purpose, to be better equipped to address contemporary challenges. Such challenges may also include finding ways for the WTO to remain relevant in a global economy that has been increasingly shifting towards digital trade. Decisions on the 1998 work program on e-commerce and on maintaining the practice of not imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions, the moratorium, have been a regular feature at past ministerial conferences. And at MC12, it is therefore likely that these elements will be up for consideration again, and their fate depends on the ability of members to find consensus. When making their decisions, members should bear in mind the importance of e-commerce and how it has been evolving very strikingly during the pandemic. COVID-19 has accelerated the growth of this sector of the economy, and the role that e-commerce is likely to play in global economic recovery should not be omitted. We also know that it is important to help to bridge the digital divide and for the WTO to support and strengthen the enabling environment for e-commerce. I'm also aware that the ESCAP regional consultation is attaching great importance to strengthening the capacity of least developed countries in the multilateral trading system. Earlier this summer, WTO members reached consensus on extending the TRIPS transition period for LDCs until 2034. This is an important decision, which was made ahead of MC12 and in recognition of LDC's special requirements and constraints and their need for flexibility to create a viable technological base. Discussions on other LDC matters at the WTO are ongoing in various formats and on various topics, such as the LDC proposal on graduation to support a smooth transition from the LDC to the developing country status, and the LDC services waiver and its operationalization, aiming to provide preferential treatment to services and services suppliers from LDCs and increase their participation in global services trade. However, whether this or other LDC issues will be ripe for an outcome at MC12 remains to be seen and depends largely on members. Now, at MC12, the participants of the various member-led initiatives are also likely to aim for deliverables, whether through the form of a declaration, stock taking, or by obtaining guidance from their ministers on future work. Significant progress has been made in several bilateral negotiations among a group of members launched in Buenos Aires in 2017. In the case of the Joint Statement Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation, it seems very likely that the group will be ready to announce an agreement in the ministerial. Significant progress is also expected on investment facilitation for development, where over 100 countries are looking at setting up a more transparent, efficient and investment-friendly business climate, but making it easier for domestic and foreign investors to invest, conduct their day-to-day business, and expand their existing investments. Meanwhile, this is a critical year as well for the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce. Members have been intensifying the pace of the talks with the view to delivering on the goal of substantial progress by MC12, guided by the co-conveners who are precisely from this region, Australia, Singapore, and Japan. Real advancement has also been seen on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises with the aim to support their role in international trade. And participants on the Initiative on Trade and Gender are also working hard to prepare a potential concrete outcome document for MC12. New initiatives were also launched in 2020 to intensify work on trade and the environment, focusing on trade and sustainability and on plastics pollution. And in July, members basically were reviewing a draft declaration on, for MC12 on trade and environmental sustainability. And I cannot emphasize how important this topic is. Trade policy has a central role to play in helping address climate change and other environmental challenges. Let us use MC12 as an opportunity to advance on many of these contemporary issues. Now, Geneva is resuming fast-paced negotiations now in September, but MC12 is rapidly approaching. We are only 3 months away and the world rightly expects WTO members to deliver significant results for the lives and livelihoods of people. And here, I want to reiterate the importance of pragmatism and flexibility. These qualities will also be crucial with respect to the format of the conference, given the many uncertainties due to the pandemic and the sanitary conditions worldwide. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, her 4 Deputy Director Generals, including myself, as well as the entire WTO Secretariat, have been committed and working tirelessly to help the organization and its members agree the core goals set in the 1994 Marrakesh Agreement, to use trade to improve living standards across the world, to create jobs, and to promote sustainable development. These are the goals the ESCAP countries also share. With these fundamental objectives in mind, action at the WTO this year at MC12, including in the areas that I have touched upon during my intervention, would help us build back a more sustainable and global economy, a better world. In this endeavor, I ask you for your continued support and engagement as we work together to get to the finish line. Thank you very much, and I wish you very good consultations in the next couple of days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle, for your introduction. The range of issues that you raise and that will be discussed at the minister conference is a bit overwhelming. But I mean, it's good to see that everything you mentioned, most of the big issues you mentioned, will be covered in this regional consultation, right? In particular, health and trade, which is the next session, and fisheries and agriculture, which is also today. Trade and environment, from what I understand, is going to be a difficult topic, but yes, it's very important in Asia and the Pacific. Countries are really lagging behind in this area when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals targets. And so if progress can be made at the WTO on that issue in some way, that would be really good. And ESCAP is working quite proactively in this area of trade and environment, and trade and climate change in particular. So thank you very much again, Annabelle, and then we will move on to the next session on health and trade. So let me invite now Mr. Darpan Jain, Joint Secretary, Department of Commerce of India, to join us for the session on health and trade as the moderator. Thank you very much, Mr. Jain, to facilitating this session. And I will let you introduce our 2 experts who are going to introduce the topic.
So thank you very much. And a very good afternoon and warm welcome to all the participants to this session on trade and health being organized by UN ESCAP. At the outset, it is my privilege to moderate this session, and I'm really grateful to the organizers for giving me this opportunity. In the background of health conditions prevailing across the globe, I think this is the most important session of this regional consultation. And perhaps that is the reason why this is the first session. COVID pandemic, as we know, has wreaked devastation across the globe. Though response in terms of development of vaccines has been very quick, its adequate production and access has remained a major concern. As against a requirement of around 11 to 12 billion doses, we have reached around 5.5 billion doses till now. However, more concerning is the trend in the percentage of population vaccinated in different countries by regions and incomes. That reveals glaring disparities. Some of the rich countries, higher income nations, have coverage of around 60 to 70%, whereas there are many nations which are around 2%, 3%. Health, in my view, is a multidimensional subject which requires comprehensive approach, an approach which should consist of measures which are preventive, diagnostics, treatment, post-treatment, a holistic approach. It would require not only access to goods in the form of devices, kits, drugs, vaccines, but also require availability of health professionals, delivery of health services through different modes, and post-treatment care. I can say from India's example, the post-COVID period has seen many innovations in delivery of health services. We have seen a significant jump in delivery of health services through online mode. Thus, in the context of international trade, my feeling is that it is a matter not only related to trade in goods, but would also cover trade in services, movement of health professionals, delivery of services through various modes, intellectual property rights, etc. An effective trade response to COVID pandemic therefore needs to be holistic on all fronts to make available complete health services to all the global citizens. Given global interconnectedness, all countries need to come together to fight against the pandemic. No one is safe till everyone is safe. Now, without taking much time, I would now like to introduce the experts for today's session. We have very eminent professors who are going to make their presentations. We have Professor Brian. Professor Brian is Simon F.S. Lee Professor of Law at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He has served as Associate Dean Research from 2010 to 14 and again from 2017 to 2019. He specializes in international economic law with particular expertise in the intersection between trade law and intellectual property rights, free trade agreements, trade in services, dispute settlement, and increasingly international investment law. So welcome, Professor Brian. Welcome to this session. I would also like to introduce Mr. Simon Evnett, who is a professor of international trade and economic development at the University of St. Gallen and co-director of the CEPR program in international trade and regional economics. Professor Evnett coordinates the Global Trade Alert Initiative. In addition to his research into the determinants of international commercial flows, he is particularly interested in the relationships between international trade policy, national competition law and policy, and economic development. A very warm welcome, Professor Simon. Now, I would request my experts to commence their presentations. Before they do that, I would just like to inform that the session is being recorded, and the structure of the session is that we would have presentations by the experts, followed by comments from representatives from different governments who are present in the session, and also question and answers from the participants. So without further ado, I would now like to request Professor Brian to kindly make his presentation. Over to you, Professor.
Great, thank you, Mr. Jain, for that introduction to the subject matter and to myself. Distinguished guest speakers, it's a pleasure to be here today and to introduce this important and contemporary issue, and one that I'm passionate about. I'm just starting to share my screen with you. I do have some slides. Okay, I assume you can see them now. I will talk about intellectual property rights and trade, but really did want to hit on and pick up something that Mr. Jain said, the increasing importance of services, that the role of services that are going to play to e-health initiatives is going to be a transformation that we would not have envisaged 15 years ago. So certainly we have to be prepared for that. So in terms of patents and innovation, I just really wanted to give a very brief overview for those participants who are not familiar with this area of or issue. So we of course have patents as a way to reward and really encourage further creativity and innovation, and at the same time to benefit society as a whole. We have a balance. We can argue about that balance, about how much actually protection is needed, but of course we have struck the the figure of 20 years from the date of filing a patent application. Now, I think the system certainly is imperfect, and to many of us, if we were to redesign or start all over, we probably wouldn't come up with this system exactly how we have it today. That being said, once something really became entrenched in the TRIPS agreement, it's going to be very hard to change anything. I wrote a paper for the E15 initiative and the WEF initiative a few years ago now, just talking about rethinking IP rights, and it really was not well received because the feeling was we can't do anything. Actually, the representative from India was one of the few that really enjoyed the paper and thought it should be taken further, and UNCTAD also were very supportive. That being said, with those criticisms, really, the state of global health has never actually been better pre-2020, okay? And the fact that we can communicate from various different parts of the world online, I mean, patents are working in some way. They have delivered, okay? We have now, 15 different vaccines being distributed, around 15. There's about 6 or 7 major ones, but several others that don't really get the press, and around 200 in development. I mean, this is extraordinary, right? This is really extraordinary. And the pandemic, we see, has of course pushed IP and innovation to the forefront. I was very skeptical that we would get a vaccine as quickly as we did. I thought cooperation would be necessary and that our R&D efforts would result in duplication and wasted efforts and lead to delays. And that's at the corner of the screen. I wrote a little article with Simon Lester talking about how patents might slow the process of getting a vaccine to us. I thought maybe we'll need a combination cocktail, etc. I'm very glad to say I was wrong, that, with unprecedented speed, we have delivered multiple vaccines at really quite reasonable prices, considering the not only health, but also economic benefits they deliver. Within a year, right, we have researched, developed, tested, rolled out multiple vaccines. Unprecedented speed of development. To put that in context, if we look at other vaccine development, right, polio has been around since the 19th century. 1957 was the first vaccine. It wasn't eradicated until the 70s. Ebola has been around really since the 1970s. It was sequenced in 1993. A vaccine was developed in 2005, but not approved for sale until 2019. MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, sequenced in 2014. We still have no vaccine. And the first SARS-CoV-1, sequenced in 2003. We still have no vaccine, probably because, of course, it really disappeared from the public. But I will like to note the research done in the early 2000s actually paved the way for a lot of the treatments and vaccines that we are seeing today. So it really did help us. This is just giving an example. I didn't create this. I think chest is shown quite prominently there, about really the 4 different types of vaccines which we're seeing come on the market. The point here, of course, is there is competition, right? There are multiple ways to attack this virus in a vaccine. The companies are not all relying on one form of technology. In your upper left-hand corner from what you can see, we see what we generally call the mRNA technology, the nucleic acid vaccines. the below it category of inactivated vaccines, this is really the older, more traditional technology that we have in use for flu and polio. Some of the more Chinese vaccine manufacturers are focusing on that, whereas in the top one we have, of course, Moderna and Pfizer, which we know, and two other forms on the right, the viral vector, which Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, and the protein model at the bottom, which is a little bit behind the others. Now, I highlight this just simply to say we're not actually in a normal situation of drug development to treat a disease or an illness. Normally, we have one drug coming on the market, and it's if it's patented, it's one seller. Maybe they license production out, but you're either going to deal with that company or you're not going to get the treatment. Here, we're in a fortunate situation because if you can't get one, you can get another. And I think this is quite important because it's not in the strategic interest of any of these innovator companies to deny a license. Doing so means less sales, it means less market share, it means less profit. And even though, of course, the vaccines are very reasonably priced now, I think some of the companies are banking on the fact that we're going to need continual boosters and that they are going to continue making profits into the future. So if you're not in and you allow another company to take that market share, that may affect long-term profits of those companies. Now, I come back to that point a little later. Now, the second thing I want to show, and I won't really hit on this, this is something the BBC put together, a little bit outdated, but again, what we have is just different methods, different efficacy rates, but importantly here, different storage, right? Different storage requirements, different requirements for distribution as well, and of course some price. Some of these prices actually on here are a little high, particularly the Pfizer-BioNTech is being sold to most places much lower than the rate that this claims. The next slide just to very quickly shows what I'm trying to show here is that the process of manufacturing a vaccine is complicated. Actually far more complicated than a medicine. You have various components which for the most part are produced by different companies, not produced by a single company. I've just listed some common elements that we have here. We have an antigen, what we call an adjuvant, and an excipient. You don't really need to know what those things do. You just need to know that they are different components which may in fact be produced in different factories owned by different companies. If we take the popular mRNA vaccine, the Pfizer-Moderna model, we have four main real parts to that. You have the modified RNA. You have some necessary filler ingredients, which are very common, like salt and sugar. But the main aspect, and the one that's very difficult to produce, are what we call lipids. They have many ingredients form a lipid. Most are unpronounceable. Some, actually a key ingredient in there is cholesterol, just to create the binding effect. The problem here, and why I highlight the lipid, is there's basically 3 manufacturing plants in the world that are producing this very necessary ingredient that is not easy to produce and not easy to store. Now, I come back to why I'm highlighting that as well with this next slide. You know, we really have major issues here beyond simply patent, right? We have manufacturing issues. We may have pricing issues, and we certainly have distribution issues. These are all really quite complex issues. We've had raw ingredient shortages. We've had production shortages. We've had shortages of glass vials, which have, remember, when you're talking about the BioNTech Pfizer that needs to be stored at -70 degrees, you can't use any glass. It has to be a very specialist glass that is made for that vial. Okay, we have shortages there. We have distribution issues. Even in Hong Kong, a logistic hub, we're probably the most advanced logistic hub in the world, or one of them. The plan was to roll out the BioNTech vaccine to private clinics. And then they thought, actually, these clinics don't have the refrigeration to store this. I mean, the afterthought actually was, we can't actually do this. We have to go back to the drawing board. I think the key here is simply to say, we need to, for me, the key is to find available manufacturing capability and to exploit it. Full stop. Now, this may involve using TRIPS flexibilities, probably not, but the fact of the matter is we need to find where there is capability and get it producing and distributing. Very complex issues though. Now, if we look, are patents the problem here? I mean, I've written a few papers on this. I'm arguing no, right? I argue no. And I have to say, I point from the start, and even if they are a little problem or become a problem later on, there are bigger problems we need to deal with. And unfortunately, actually, I think the global community as a concerted, coherent effort is not dealing with them to a large extent. Now, I found it very interesting in that original waiver proposal in October. It essentially said, we need to correct a problem. IP is a barrier to access. But think about it, it was written in October of 2020, and right about 2 sentences later, it said, there is to date no vaccine or medicine to effectively prevent or treat COVID-19. So at the same time, the paper is saying there's no effective vaccine or treatment, it's saying IP is a problem to access. Access for what? There was nothing at the time. Okay, so I did tend to look very skeptical at that paper after reading that sentence in, I think, the first or second paragraph of that proposal. Now, the waiver negotiations, I think, are important. They're getting governments involved, and they're letting innovators know that this is an important international issue and that access is important, and if they don't respond, something may be done. My fear is that it is distracting attention away from other very serious issues. The concentrated manufacturing of inputs and final products, narrow supply chains, distribution, and also, of course, the impact on innovation later. Governments have really just shifted. We used to say 70% of people vaccinated means herd immunity. Now we're saying that's not good enough. With these mutations, we're going to need continued R&D. It's obvious, and it's critical. My other issue here is in terms of if a waiver is agreed today, what's the result? What's the result? Would manufacturing capability suddenly appear? How long would it take for countries to implement a waiver? Remember, a waiver is of TRIPS obligations, but countries will still need to go back and change their own domestic law in order to put it into effect. Some countries, some developing countries, have not put into effect TRIPS flexibilities yet. But we're going to assume that they're going to put into an effect to change legislation overnight, within a month, within a few weeks. I don't know how long. How long would it take? Would some countries even do it? Would the US do it? I'm pretty skeptical, I have to say. Are vaccines even patented in all of these countries? This is a question no one has asked. I can assure you, in a lot of LDCs, there's no patents over the vaccines. Okay? So these are huge questions. I think other questions like, how are these companies going to transfer know-how and trade secrets? And how are they going to get it back afterwards, or what? I think we really need to deal with them. And the TRIPS negotiations can deal with some of them. That last issue, actually, they can deal with. The other issues, it is going to be more difficult. You know, I think at best, we're talking months and months away here, which then we even have to add time to actually a response on the ground. I think serious issues here of manufacturing capabilities and capacity, the complex processes involved, and the finding spare manufacturing capacity are actually really quite pressing issues. Something that was mentioned in the news a few weeks ago, but not really highlighted at all, was essentially a Korean factory needing to go actually to BioNTech and Pfizer and get more transfer. In fact, the Koreans, who we think are very technologically advanced, we have a factory producing high-level vaccines already, actually had problems making the mRNA vaccine. They couldn't do it, actually. So the likelihood that we're going to set up a new factory from scratch and have them start making these drugs very quickly at a safe and effective level early on, I think we need to step back. And when we step back, try to change my slide here. When we step back, I think we need to look at a lot more issues here. And I think this is where we need the enhanced cooperation for this pandemic, but importantly for the next. And I think Ms. Gonzalez mentioned this, not only for this, but for next. We need to start planning. We're almost too late now. So basic research, we need to coordinate and collaborate, more sharing of basic data. We obviously need diversification of supply chains and manufacturing, but I think this is easier said than done. It's very easy for governments to say, diversify, produce in multiple locations. Industry, though, manufactures in certain locations for many reasons: safety, quality, price, etc. They're not going to shift without any encouragement to do so unless if it's in their interest. So this is where governments and intergovernmental agencies also have a role to play in inducing diversification. We need to encourage licenses, and governments need to encourage licenses, whether that's cross-industry licenses for R&D, patent pools, voluntary licenses, even compulsory licenses, all of them, if that's what it takes. Strategic thinking we need on emergency distribution, coordinated plans of action, not only for this pandemic, as I said, but likely for the next, which I think we know will come. We just don't know what it will be and when. And lastly, of course, is regulatory rules. I think here is a hurdle we're not looking at, and we need to. It's not only just, okay, few essential medicines are patented, but look beyond. Why is it that in developing countries for basic medicines, you know, the developing countries, LDCs are paying 20 or 30 times what the price is of developed country for very basic drugs, aspirin, paracetamol, things like this. There's a lack of competition in the marketplace. There's multiple layers of distributions. There's tariff rates that add to the effect. There's corruption. There's poor procurement strategies. Even in Hong Kong, I will say, the hospital authority is very poor, in my estimation, procurement strategies that don't look at patent expiration dates too closely. A lack of regulatory oversight, infrastructure, etc. These issues, actually, which are, I think, for the most part solvable, if at the very least we can do better at. I think we're not really speaking about that at a coordinated international level. And here are where I think small steps could actually have a big impact on increasing access. So I think I'll stop there. I think my time is up, and I will hand the floor over back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Brian. We'll take questions after Professor Simon's presentation. So over to you, Professor Simon, for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Chairman, for this introduction, and I'll try and raise my slides now and move straight to my presentation. I'm going to focus my presentation on the question of vaccine supply chains. Now, let me just say before I get into this, this session is called Trade and Health, and if we had gone back perhaps 12 months to 15 months, we would not have been talking about vaccine supply chains. We would have been talking about disruption of deliveries of personal protective equipment and other medical equipment. And so there is an important side to trade and health, which has nothing to do with vaccines. Obviously, given where we are at in the world today, there's a lot more interest in vaccines. And so I will spend my time talking about the developments on the demand side and on the supply side for vaccines. My choice of this dichotomy, demand and supply, I think immediately reveals that I'm an economist, and hopefully I will complement what Brian has said on the legal side. I've structured the conversation this way. I will identify 3 trade policy questions which I think come immediately out of looking at the mismatch between supply and demand. And there is, I think, a deeper question also that I want to touch on at the end, which will relate to government intervention in this area more generally. So let's proceed then, starting on the demand side. On the demand side, if we had had this discussion perhaps 6 months ago, when it was expected that individuals needed either 1 or 2 doses of COVID-19 vaccine, and if we had inoculated 70% of the world's population, then we had a very clear production target, which was around 11 to 12 billion doses to be delivered this year, assuming that you needed 2 doses for 1 individual. And so about 6 months ago, the discussions were really oriented around getting to 11 to 12 billion. Now that's a very important question, because normal production of vaccines was something in the range of 1 to 2 billion doses of non-COVID related vaccines. So we're talking about scaling up an industry roughly 6 times, at least 6 times, in order to meet the supply needs here. And of course, repurposing old vaccine production lines to COVID isn't trivial either. So the question really was 6 months ago, how do we scale up 600%? Interestingly, as I'll say when I start talking about the supply side, that target was increasingly coming into loom, and I'll explain why soon. But since this 6 months interval has been undertaken, we've had changes in the demand estimates, and it's important to understand why, because I think this will actually have a material impact on the commercial logic of vaccine production. So these estimates have been called into question for 3 reasons. First, precisely because we've had such a dreadful distribution outcomes with respect to vaccines, we now have the developments of a number of different variants. Now, at the moment, there's a lot of attention given to the Delta variant, but it's not just the Delta variant, which is important. We've had other variants too, and these variants have spread, and every time we have a new variant, there is a concern that the existing vaccines may not be as effective against them. The second important factor is that over time, some vaccines are losing their efficacy, and this has created demand for booster shots. And if you decide that in a 12-month period, 70% of the adults population need a booster shot, then you can take this 11 to 12 billion number and you can add 50% already. So you can see it's a quite sizable increase in the market size. And then the final point is that there have been decisions taken in some countries to inoculate children as well as adults. And these decisions are probably questionable on medical grounds. Indeed, I'm currently in the United Kingdom, and earlier this week, the Vaccine Advisory Committee here decided that it was not clear that there was a case for inoculating 12 to 18-year-olds or 12 to 15-year-olds. But still, the government is probably going to do this because I think parents will ultimately demand it. And so, of course, every time we decide to inoculate children in some countries, this, of course, reduces the amount of supply of vaccines which are available for other countries as well. And so there's a very important distributional question here. So as a result of these 3 developments, at the moment, we don't really know what the total demand is, but other than it will be above 11 to 12 billion per year. But we do know for sure that this industry needs to dramatically expand its capacity to produce. And that's then what takes us to the supply side of the story. And let's see what the developments are there. Well, as of last Friday, the best estimates of the total level of production of COVID vaccine is that just over 5.8 billion doses have been produced. Now, these estimates come from Airfinity, who are a specialist consulting company in London who track very meticulously vaccine production. They're probably the best outfit in the world. Now, of those 5 billion doses, really production is concentrated in 4 vaccines where over 1 billion doses have been produced. 2 in China, 2 outside of China. And so we have essentially production of 4 vaccines, which is growing. And we also have a number of other vaccines which are more newer vintage, who are scaling up, but they have yet to reach the 1 billion dose mark. Now, how do we interpret this scale up? My assessment is that this is impressive. If I had tried to persuade you almost a year ago, or even 6 months ago, that we would have produced roughly 1 billion doses per month, or we'd be producing 1 billion or 1.5 billion doses a month by now, you would have laughed me out of court. The private sector scale up here has been nothing short of remarkable, especially given the risks which I'm about to talk about later. Furthermore, what's interesting is that this scale up of production has pretty much followed the forecasts which have been made. And so it's very, it seems that forecasting vaccine production is not like forecasting the weather or like macroeconomic forecasts where there's huge amounts of randomness. Actually, once you start tracking mechanically what's going on, the forecasts are pretty accurate. Or let's put it this way, the forecast errors are pretty small. And so that's why it's then worth going back to what those forecasts were showing for the rest of this year. And if you look at the Airfinity forecasts, they are talking about a production in excess of 11 billion, enough to have met to inoculate 70% of the world's adult population. And the other important thing about the forecasts were that the expansion of production in the final quarter of the year was going to be very, very large indeed, because you have more and more of the newer vaccines coming online, or things like Johnson & Johnson's vaccine, for example. And so what I take from that is that the vaccine scale up is on track. However, this last quarter of the year is very important. And this is where, you know, if your working hypothesis is that the amount of final vaccine is generates a proportional demand for vaccine ingredients, if you're worried about vaccine ingredient shortages, they would show up in the final quarter of this year. And I think that's ultimately one thing we would have to look for. But the really overwhelming picture I want you to take away from this is that the private sector scaling up, even under the existing trade rules regimes and the existing national regimes, has been nothing less than remarkable and far in excess of just about what anyone suggested last year. And so this should make you begin to reflect on, okay, why has this happened, and is there a risk that we are, by the actions that we take at the national or the multilateral level, undermining this impressive scale up which has happened to date? And so this is, I think, a very important first point on the subject of on the level of supply which is out there. Now, if one wants to dig deeper into the supply chains for vaccines, one has to remember that the production of vaccines goes through various stages, from origination to manufacturing to filling and finishing and distribution. And this is where, you know, our colleagues, both of my colleagues who've spoken, have talked about the need for a holistic approach. And this is exactly why I agree with this comment, which is that when you see that there are 4 separate stages, all of these stages have to be aligned in order to produce vaccines effectively. And we need to have not only the ingredients, the capital equipment, we also need to have the expertise, whether it's at the manufacturing stage, the filling and finishing stage, and the vaccine distribution stage. So that's your health professionals and the like. And so you can see that a lot of things have to come together in order to get vaccines from development into people's arms. And not all of these stages here are things which can be fixed with trade policy. Many of them could be fixed with domestic policy. And this is the bit which is perhaps a little bit depressing, which is that there are real talent constraints along this supply chain, especially in the production of the new vaccines or the mRNA vaccines, and as our chairman said, at the final stage in distribution of vaccines as well with healthcare professionals. And so it may well be that when the history of this period is written, that people look back at the talent shortages as the reason why the scale up in production was and distribution was not fast enough, was not faster. Now, there are three trade policy dimensions to this particular problem that we can identify, and I will go through each of them. Now, these are, of course, where the discussion starts to get a little bit controversial, but we have seen a number of different export controls put in place by different countries. And these export controls often come in lots of different shapes and sizes. Very few of them are explicit export bans, but they are often hidden or buried in procurement measures. They could possibly be buried in export authorization regimes and alike. And we have different restraints which we have seen over the past year or so. And indeed, my team tracks these restraints rather systematically. I should say we've seen relatively few new restraints in Q2 of this year. So there's been much less of that. But a very important dimension of this, which of course received a lot of attention earlier in the year, were the potential for export curbs. Now, in terms of thinking through what the consequences of this, and again in subsequent research, my colleagues and I have looked into this, you want to identify, I think, different groups of countries. Some countries are final vaccine producers, some produce vaccine ingredients, and some produce neither. And if I look into the delivery data, which again Affinity supplies, if you are a vaccine producer or a vaccine ingredients manufacturer, the share of the final vaccines which are delivered to your country is much higher than if you're outside of that club. And so there is an important distributional question which has arisen, and that may well have arisen not because of the export curbs per se, but simply because countries realize that they need to source these specialist ingredients like lipids and the like from other countries, and you don't want to provoke a potential supplier by curbing final vaccine shipments to them. Perhaps the best example of this, which was documented by Chad Bown and his colleague Bolowski, is that even at the height of the UK-EU disagreement over AstraZeneca vaccines, the EU did not block the shipments of AstraZeneca vaccines to the UK, probably because they're importing a large share of the lipid nanoparticles from the UK for the production of the Pfizer vaccine. So these types of supply chain interdependencies may well have limited the impact of these export curbs, but that it would be remiss of me not to mention this as one of the three issues. The second of the three issues is one that Brian has already talked about, and this is the efforts to try and negotiate a TRIPS waiver in Geneva. There has been, I will not add too much to the commentary of Brian there. I will say I think that it seems unlikely that there will be much progress before MC12. Countries seem to be very, very far apart on this particular issue, and I think there's an open question as to whether or not it's absolutely necessary. But still, this issue is on the table, and we couldn't do a regional consultation on trade and health without mentioning the TRIPS waiver considerations. I think the question I would ask, having reviewed the documentation again this morning, is what are we really trying to achieve here, and which bottlenecks are we really unplugging here with a TRIPS waiver? And I would also turn the question around, which is to say, how happy are we with the current operations of the TRIPS agreement in light of what we've seen with the vaccine scale up? The third issue which has come up, and Brian has alluded to this a bit, and also our chairman, has to do with the facilitation of trade facilitation and the importation of vaccines. So if one takes the holistic view, the production of vaccines is important, but getting vaccines into people's arms is also important. And there appears to be in some countries problems getting vaccines through customs and and for their use in national health systems. Now, some countries like the United States have tried to link trade facilitation here to the implementation of the agreement on trade facilitation. I'm not entirely sure that one has to do. This is an area where unilateral policy change by countries could well be the thing to do in the short term. But this is another issue which has been discussed at the General Council at the WTO, and again, it would be remiss of me not to have mentioned this. So there's a potential trade facilitation dimension as well. The final dimension, which is being discussed actively in Geneva, but has nothing to do, I think, with respect to the agreements of the WTO, has to do with the monitoring of vaccine production chains or supply chains. And here, there are real gaps in our knowledge as to how these supply chains are organized. And that's not because anyone has been has not done their job well or has not performed effectively. We have to remember that companies in the production of their goods, being able to organize an effective supply chain is a competitive advantage. And why would any company want to advertise the structure of its supply chain and who its suppliers are if it is indeed a competitive advantage? After all, they may end up finding their suppliers migrating to other rivals. And so we have an area where the private sector has an incentive to get it right. They have very strong incentives to run effective supply chains, but they don't necessarily have incentives to run transparent supply chains. And of course, in the case of a pandemic where there are geographical risks, it may be that the suppliers for vaccine production in certain areas are concentrated in a certain geographical area, which could create risks if that area is locked down. And so we'd have I think it's a legitimate transparency problem which needs to be tackled. And it's not clear here how to do that without intruding on how the private sector organizes its supply chains or encouraging the information to be shared. Now, there are some companies which are trying to trace this out, but again, this is an area which is very new ground, I think, for many governments and certainly for the WTO. All right, so these are the trade policy questions. Now let's just dig a little deeper in the short period of time I have left. Why was there so little production capacity for vaccines in the first place? And there is the very simple answer to this question is that vaccine production traditionally has been vertically integrated. That is, the companies which have researched the vaccines have also produced them and done the fill and finish. And more importantly, the business model for these vaccines is lousy. And it's lousy partly because of endemic uncertainty, but it's also lousy because of a huge amount of policy-related risk as well. Policy-induced risk. And so vaccine production typically requires large upfront investment, not just in the R&D, but also in the production facilities. The vaccine R&D can come to nothing. Ask Sanofi, the French company. Their vaccine didn't work out. There's an Australian company whose vaccine R&D did not work out. So this is highly risky, and there's no apparent compensation for taking those risks. What governments are prepared to pay for is the jabs which get produced. And again, and think about where we were 12 months ago, most experts at the time thought we would just need 1 or 2 jabs in order to develop enough resistance to COVID. And so anyone producing a COVID-19 vaccine or expecting to do so this time last year was looking at essentially a world market of 11 to 12 billion doses, and that's it. So it's a one-shot revenue stream. It's not a sustained revenue stream. This is why the discussion I made earlier about how demand patterns are changing is so important, because what it suggests is there may now be recurring demand for vaccine and vaccine boosters. So as we go from a pandemic to an endemic, the revenue model uncertainty may diminish. But the key thing here is there is, in production of vaccines, especially pandemic-related vaccines, there may only be a limited time period of which the firms can actually sell the vaccines and to recover their investments. This is often made worse, and this is the policy risk, by the fact that in previous pandemics, which have worked out less badly, which is good news, many governments just cancelled contracts of vaccines. And the firms which had invested heavily in producing them and getting the production facilities found themselves with suboptimal returns. It's not a surprise that not every possible vaccine producer chose not to produce a COVID-19 vaccine. In the view of some people, they have been burned in the past by bad government policy. And this is the side that governments don't talk about. And we must be honest about that. There can be supply chain disruption with vaccine ingredient problems. And there are also largely very important questions about the technical capabilities of companies to raise productivity to the right levels. And so we have seen in the case of in the European Union, AstraZeneca's subsidiaries had very considerable difficulties initially raising productivity to levels which would enable it to meet its obligations to the European Union, and this was a source of major commercial dispute. We've also seen in other parts of the world difficulties in companies raising productivity levels to the levels they expected, and I would just highlight the various statements of the CEO of the Serum Institute of India and describing the difficulties his company has had in meeting their production targets. So there are very important constraints here in terms of expertise and talent, even for organizations like the Serum Institute, which have a great track record of producing vaccines over 50 years. And so this is a hugely risky activity, and there are very good reasons why production capacity was constrained before the pandemic, and why the scale up, although it's impressive, does have some constraints. The last observation to make very quickly is, well, which countries got this right? Well, there are two countries which are widely regarded as having developed vaccine production capacity very quickly, and that is the US and the UK. And they did one thing which they often publicly criticize, which is industrial policy. The very countries which have criticized other countries for using industrial policy actually invested along the entire supply chain. They de-risked investment. They consciously de-risked investment. So they addressed every single one of the problems on that last slide that I showed you. And they took the view that developing vaccines is like an investment portfolio. It's a whole series of risky assets or projects, and you should hold multiple potential options and invest in all of them. And both countries insisted on developing domestic production capacity. So this seemed to be the model. Now, of course, some countries are going to say, well, look, this goes to show we need industrial policy. I would just urge you to say that the UK model is an interesting model. To US and UK model are interesting, but we should also understand that there are other countries which a decade or so ago decided that they were going to have an industrial policy for vaccines after a pandemic, spent a lot of money on this, and were unable to ramp up production or develop vaccines this time around. And the leading example is Korea, which has spent a huge amount of money since the SARS pandemic. And there's been no COVID-19 vaccine developed in Korea. As Brian has highlighted, there have been difficulties in ramping up the production of mRNA vaccines because of technical expertise shortages with this new vaccine. And Korea was very slow to start vaccinating. And in fact, in the middle of last month, only 20% of people have been double vaccinated in Korea. And so the one country in your region which really, really prepared for the pandemic and had an active industrial policy seriously underperformed. So anyone thinking that that industrial policy must be the solution really, I think, needs to look at the factual record. Let me draw together the arguments then. We have seen on the demand side an incredible shift in view away from a clear production target of 11 to 12 billion to a number now which is much larger but uncertain. We have seen on the supply side a very impressive expansion in supply, but the biggest expansion is expected to happen in the last quarter of this year, and that may well be held up because of vaccine ingredient shortages. We will see. If you're asking yourself, why were we not better prepared for this pandemic? And that is because the business case for vaccine production is lousy. It is fraught with risks, And I'm afraid a lot of that risk comes from the public sector. And indeed, this is where the importance of domestic policy is important. Unfortunately, there has been an antagonistic relationship between the pharmaceutical companies and governments over the years, and this has not helped. And the companies concerned understand that this is a problem, and this has been a problem which has bedeviled the relations. In my view, like a bit, or as Brian said, in my view, in light of the holistic approach that one needs to take with this issue, the TRIPS waiver is a sideshow compared to what actually needs to be done. And when you turn to what needs to be done, you have to think along the entire supply chain, as we have. You have to address the three issues that I talked about earlier. And you have to worry, I think, about vaccine ingredients potentially slowing down the scale up. In terms of the deeper lessons in terms of industrial policy, here we will be debating this for, I'm sure, decades. But I think there has been mixed success with industrial policy solutions. And the case of Korea should stand as a point of caution to anyone who thinks that the US and UK experience augurs a new era of industrial policy in vaccine supply. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Simon, for your presentation and going into the demand and supply side of the vaccines. Now I have a request from Philippines government. I think Mrs. Mari Sherilyn wants to make some comments. So I would like to invite Mari Sherilyn for her comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marie Sherilyn Aquia from the Philippines Department of Trade and Industry. Let me first extend the Philippines' appreciation to the ESCAP for organizing this regional consultation, as well as to the Executive Secretary Armida Alish Jabana, and also the representative of Vice Minister Sabi Rovna of the Ministry of Trade and Integration of Kazakhstan. Thank you also to the WTO Secretariat's Deputy Director General Annabel Gonzalez for the update on the state of affairs in the preparations for MC12. Let me also thank Professor Brian Mercurio and Professor Simon Evanet for providing the introduction and the excellent presentations on the trade and health issues, their perspectives, as well as an introduction on the initiatives in the WTO in this important issue. The Philippines recognizes that trade policy has an important role to play to address the issues and challenges of global supply chains during this pandemic and in stimulating global economic recovery. Technology is not the issue. We are in a good place, as we heard from the presentations. Supply constraints and protectionism have characterized the market for vaccines, therapies, and essential goods. We must address these challenges so that all countries can have equitable and fair access to diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines, which are necessary to contain COVID-19 and to allow our economies to fully reopen. We note that the proposal on trade and health, COVID-19 and beyond, originally initiated by the Ottawa Group, has been gaining support among the WTO's membership and may provide key elements to the 12th MC outcomes at the end of the year. The Philippines welcomes the objectives of the initiative and supports the trade facilitation elements of the proposal. We value an uninterrupted trade and open markets, as shown through the Philippines' efforts to avoid imposing export bans or restrictions on essential products. We are closely monitoring the proposal as well as the facilitator-led process of Ambassador David Walker, and our mission in Geneva remains ready to engage in these discussions. On the intellectual property aspect, the Philippines is closely reviewing proposals submitted to the General Council and TRIPS Council, including 1, India and South Africa's proposal for a General Council decision to waive certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement, and 2, the European Union's proposal for a General Council declaration on the TRIPS agreement and public health in the circumstances of a pandemic. Likewise, we commend the WTO Director General's initiative which has been characterized as the third way that has created the space for dialogue between the public and private sectors. We are broadly supportive of all proposals that aim to ramp up the production of COVID-19 vaccines, medicines, and technologies to ensure the equitable, timely, and affordable access for these critical products. Beyond these proposals, we encourage members to consider the role that technology transfer plays, as well as time-bound voluntary and special compulsory licensing of intellectual property rights. The Philippines remains committed to supporting an enabling and predictable regulatory environment for pharmaceutical manufacturing investments, which would support both our national resilience as well as open the door for future collaborative arrangements with our partners. We also look to developed countries to take more positive actions that will stimulate broader vaccine production and unhampered distribution of quality and affordable vaccines and essential goods. The Philippines shares a common desire to contain and end this pandemic. We are hopeful that our collective efforts, enhanced cooperation, and the work in the WTO can provide us with complementary pathways that will help us exit this crisis. And yes, this will require both political resolve and pragmatic decision-making. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Mary Sherilyn. Now I would like to request representative from Vietnam government, Mrs. La, to make her comments. Mrs. Na, please.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, good evening to people who are living in different time zones. My name is Nga Le, and I'm working for the Vietnam Ministry of Industry and Trade, particularly the WTO and Trade Negotiation Divisions of the Multilateral Trade Policy Departments. And it is my honor today to be invited to share some of the comments from the perspective of the government. I would like to thank you, the UN ESCAP organizers, for organizing this consultation, and also to the speakers today, especially Ms. Annabel Gonzalez, the DDG of the WTO. I'm also very thankful for the very informative presentations about giving the overview situation about the vaccines related trade policies in the world, especially its IPR related issues. So now I would like to make some inputs based on the social economics situations in Vietnam, focusing on trade. And I would consider my inputs as further elaborations and complementaries to the presentations that we just listened. So as we all know, Vietnam has been a very active members in the multilateral trading system. We opened our national economy in 1986 via the National Reform Policy. And since then, the trading has become a very important contributor to the economic growth of our country. And very recent statistics show that our national trade volume increased 170% times compared to when we just started our national economic reforms 35 years ago. And in 2007, we became a member of the WTO, and within 14 years since our accession to the WTO, our trade volume observed a 5-time growth. And up to date, Vietnam has signed 15 free trade agreements, FTAs, with more or less 54 trading partners, either as a standing alone country or as part of the ASEAN members. And we have free trade deals with big partners such as the European Union, or India or China or ASEAN, Southeast Asian associations. And for the last few years, Vietnam has concluded and signed 3 historic FTAs. The first one is the CPTPP, which makes up of 13.5% of the global GDP, and it's one of the largest trading blocs in the world. We also signed the FTA with the European Union, and as you may know, the GDP share of the EU accounts for more than 15% of the global GDP share. And also last year, we also signed the bilateral trade agreement with the UK to ensure that the trade between the 2 countries is not affected by political situation like the Brexit. In 2020 alone, our total trade value was $543.9 billion, and of which the export value was $281.5 billion. Our biggest trading partners include China and the US and the EU. In particular, only in 2020, the total trade value between Vietnam and these 3 partners reached more than $280 billion. So given the above figures, it can be said without a doubt that Vietnam plays a very crucial role in the global trading system. And as such, the COVID-19 pandemic not only disrupted the supply chain at the global level, but it also considerably affected Vietnam's economy and trade. So recently, there's been a rising wave of the pandemic in Southeast Asia, and unfortunately, Vietnam is among the countries that is suffering. The most restricted lockdown policy is applied to all of the big cities of our countries in the last few months. Including Ho Chi Minh City. And Ho Chi Minh City is our biggest cities in the country, and it plays the most important contribution to the Vietnamese economy and trade. For your reference, I would provide some figures. In 2020, the export value of Ho Chi Minh City was $44.35 billion. The import value reached $51.3 billion. And in total, the trade value of the city was more than $95 billion. And it accounts for 17.6% of the country's total trade value in 2020. So this lockdown policy that we have, which says stay wherever you are, and it affects hugely the production and the import-export as a whole. And our government agreed that the vaccinations would be considered the silver bullet, so that the country can soon continue our economic activities and come back to our normal state. And just to make some brief comments on Mr. Simon Evnitz's presentation about the supply and the demands of the vaccinations. The situation is that until yesterday, there is approximately 3.2 million people in Vietnam are fully vaccinated. And we received more than 30 million doses of vaccines, either through the COVAX mechanism or commercially purchased. However, this is a very humble figure compared to our very challenging target. We aim to have more 120 million doses of vaccines from now until the end of 2021. Because we need to vaccinate fully for 75% of our populations. So the shortage of vaccines makes things more difficult, and it means that we are not able to obtain the herd immunity in any time soon. And it also means that the more time we would need to reopen our economy and trade. So given our important positions in the multilateral trading system, I believe that it will also significantly affect the global trade as a whole. And I think that our country is not an exceptional case. I think that our country is only among the many countries whose trade and economies are suffering due to the lack of vaccines. So my take-home message is that we're living in the era of globalization. And so if one country doesn't have sufficient vaccines, it is not only that specific countries that has to suffer and is losing in the battle against the coronavirus, but many other regions and countries in the world are also suffering in one way or another. So that is all that I would like to share regarding Vietnam's situation. And thank you very much for listening. And I'm very much interested in hearing opinions from other participants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Na, for sharing your thoughts. And all of us are aware Vietnam has emerged as a major trading nation in last few years. And thanks for all the information which you provided. Now, I think we still have some more time for some questions and answers. Maybe some participants, if they would like to ask questions, they could either raise their hand or they could unmute themselves, introduce and ask questions. So the floor is now open. I can't see any hand. Anyone? We have some questions in the chat box. Yeah, I think there is a hand up in the participant list from Philippine side. Kindly go ahead. Kindly unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wish to thank, I'm Gina Hamoralin from the Department of Foreign Affairs. I work for the Office of the International Economic Relations. I would like to thank ESCAP for organizing this excellent venue as a learning forum for all of us. I also would like to thank WTO through the Deputy Director General for giving us a very comprehensive state of play of the WTO process. Also, I would like to thank our presenters are very educational information. I would like to add to what our colleague from the Department of Trade has said earlier, that while we engage in intensive discussions on COVID-19 related initiatives in Geneva, we also I would also like to note that the global trading community would be greatly reassured by the members' continued faithful adherence to the core principles of the WTO, despite the challenges what we are confronted with. Transparency must continue to be observed, and unilateral measures on trade to satisfy domestic requirements must continue to be observed and must continue to be complied with the criteria that they should not be trade restrictive and has factual basis. These things we no longer have to discuss, as there are already rules that we are bound to observe, and our continued observance of these rules could greatly contribute to minimize the impacts of the pandemic to global trade. The issue of transparency was brought up by one of our speakers. Trade generates revenues needed by governments to fight COVID, not only in supporting the respective healthcare systems, but also in alleviating the suffering of those that have been deprived of livelihood and jobs due to the impact of the pandemic. Most of the initiatives I have noted are focused on trade in goods. The Philippines, whose economy is strongly based on services trade, is also severely impacted, as operations in the sectors we are engaged in, like transportation and tourism, are very far from their pandemic level of operation. We hope the WTO could also devote attention to trade in services, especially in the movement in natural persons, as this would greatly help in our economic recovery. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much. There is a hand up from Uzbekistan side. Kindly go ahead. Kindly introduce.
Hello. Good morning in Geneva. Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. I'm Askar Mirsaidov from Permanent Mission of Uzbekistan. First of all, I would like to give a big appreciation and thanks to organizers, ESCAP, and for you, Chairperson, for arranging this very important meeting. And this important meeting is very important for us, for Uzbekistan, because we are not yet members, but we are acceding to WTO. And over the last 2 or 3 years, we are accelerating our accession process. And we hope we can join the WTO at last for after 5 years. As you know, over the last 5 years, there are no new country acceded to WTO. And we hope that from forthcoming MC12, there might be some country who might join to WTO, but according to latest developments, it's getting very difficult to join the WTO, and we hope that there would be support for acceding countries to join WTO. In the course of your presentation session, first, I have just one question regarding IP issues. Of course, these issues are very important, taking into account the current circumstances and current problems that are facing globally. I have just a question to panelists. Do you think that during the MC12, WTO members can achieve some kind of result, clear and achievable results, or do you think that the forthcoming event will be another chance to declare the parties to raise their positions? I just want to say that, can we get some clear response out of this important meeting? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think Mr. Simon had touched upon this in his presentation. Would you like to respond, Simon, on the question which has been asked?
Thank you, Chairman. My understanding, having spoken to a number of people in Geneva in the last couple of weeks on the trade and health file, is that the entire file is moving forward very, very slowly, and that expectations for what will be accomplished at MC12 are being lowered across the board on the entire trade and health file. So it's not just trade, and it's not just the IP issue. In the other areas of export controls, trade facilitation, and alike. And so this is, in my view, a regrettable development, but I think it would be optimistic to expect a breakthrough on the IP issues in the time we have left, unless there's a big shift in government positions, and one does not see the big players moving in that direction anytime soon, or at least any domestic developments which suggest they would move in that direction. So I'm afraid I wish I had better news for you. I would say perhaps just one other thing, which is that it is important what we can accomplish together at the WTO and what we can accomplish regionally. But there was a lot in what myself and Brian said about what countries can do unilaterally to help their own situations too. And I hope that doesn't get lost in this discussion.
Thank you very much.
I might jump in there if I can, Chair.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I obviously agree with Simon. I think what we've seen in the past at ministerials is if they're close on something, then maybe the ministerial can push it through or gain consensus. At this stage, I'm very skeptical. We're still actually arguing about whether there should be a waiver, and even deep divisions about what that should cover, what products are covered, and I think really importantly the length of time. I mean, I was not very encouraged when I saw the revised proposal, right, which essentially is an indefinite waiver until the General Council would state that it's no longer needed. And of course, with consensus decision making, that could be forever. And I just don't see how many countries would ever agree to that proposal. So I think we're really far away on a number of issues. So yeah, I mean, I think Simon and I also agree that you know, in parallel, perhaps now is the time to look at unilateral, but also you know, regional and other intergovernmental ways of actually trying to get through this pandemic.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. I think Mr. Sujat Ahmed wants to ask a question. Sujat, can you go ahead?
Thank you, Chair. And it was a wonderful session. My talk from Brian was very much fascinating because of my area. My question is to Brian. As far as developing countries are concerned, and while we are looking for the vaccine and everything related to the COVID-19 pandemic, the cost of regulations is higher in comparison to the cost of intellectual property rights. In IPO, for example, if I take the case of Pakistan, IPO framework is much weaker in comparison to the compliance of the regulators. So how you're going to look at while taking a study for developing countries and for those LDCs and UDCs as defined in the textbooks. Thank you.
Okay, you were a bit faint, so I had a little trouble hearing every word you said, but I think what you said was that IP is one issue, but there's also regulatory issues about getting the vaccines approved for marketing in countries. Yeah, no, that's true. And in fact, I mean, you know, we've had to cut, well, everyone has had to cut many corners throughout this process, right? I mean, testing normally takes 8 to 12 years, and we've taken under 1 year. That's on average 8 to 12 years, sometimes much longer, and we've taken, you know, 1. What we see is a lot of regulators getting around actually the process of the very strict process of regulatory approval by approving these vaccines just on an emergency basis. So at some points, and we are seeing the US shift over to actual approval as opposed to just emergency basis, which really requires a lot less submissions of documents and of clinical trial, less scrutiny of clinical trial data. So, I mean, I think that that's certainly to be encouraged. We are in an unprecedented pandemic, at least in our lifetimes. I think there is going to be a line in which regulators, you know, will begin to pull back, but I don't think we're really close to that at all. I think most countries, if they're able to get any of the vaccines, they are very quickly approving them on an emergency basis for distribution in their countries.
My apologies, Chair. Just to follow up from your response, won't it have higher cost of trade in this whole scenario?
I'm sorry, higher cost of
trade. Higher cost of trade.
I'm sorry, I was not. Yeah, I don't necessarily. I guess I'm not sure I see that trade angle there. I mean, you could elaborate if you'd like on how that would be a cost. I mean, the way I see it, we're really trying to facilitate the regulators are trying to facilitate the trade in vaccines because they need them, right? I mean, I just saw, for instance, I know the Vietnamese delegate spoke, Ms. No, I saw that Vietnam has just procured quite a lot of drugs from Cuba, the new Cuban vaccine. You know, I highly doubt 6 months ago that the Vietnamese regulators were looking at the Cuban vaccine. It's been in its infancy at that stage. I suspect they are approving it now while the shipments are on the way. So, you know, this is I don't necessarily see it as a trade restriction issue. I mean, to be perfectly frank, in the longer term, it's going to be a health issue. We have the regulators there and we have stringent processes for a reason. We are, of course, cutting corners at this stage out of sheer necessity, not out of our really willing desire to do so.
Thank you so much, Brian. I would now, I mean, I think we have only 5 minutes, and I think the focus of the discussion today has been on IPR issues, other issues also Professor Simon pointed out. I would like to ask one question. Of course, both the speakers were a bit harsh on the TRIPS waiver proposal from India. And as a moderator, I didn't have chance and opportunity to comment on that, but we will reserve it for some other time. I just wanted to seek your views very quickly on what can be done to promote cross-border trade in services, health services. I think, Brian, you said something needs to be done. We need to be prepared for that. I think Philippines also in their intervention mentioned about movement of health professionals. So what needs to be done? What trade policy intervention or what countries can do to further promote trade in health services or cross-border trade in health services?
Well, I mean, I work actually very closely with a number of governments, and I've worked very closely with ASEAN over the past few years on trade and services on this issue. And I mean, the first thing I can say is most countries' commitments in terms of health-related services, not only at the WTO level, but also in free trade agreements, is very weak. And you can say maybe on the one hand, it's for protection reasons, but there are also good reasons for that. And I would say, you know, again, regulatory reasons. They're looking at it from a health perspective, and they want to ensure that proper care is given to their citizens, etc. So I think again, and I hate to sound like a broken drum here, but coordination, and this time it's going to be coordination at the domestic level, getting the trade ministries, the health ministries, and other related ministries together to actually say, where can we, where is it possible to allow for services trade in you know, for instance, again, e-diagnosis, telediagnosis, etc. Where is it possible for us to do that in a manner that's safe for our citizens, but also what can we do from a trade perspective to facilitate that and allow that to occur?
Well, I think I would agree with where Brian's going with this. I think it's important to differentiate across modes of supply and think about policy along each mode. I think the rise of digitally delivered medical services is a huge opportunity for a number of Asian countries. Actually, we know, it's my understanding that Thailand has made great strides here. This is also an area where I suspect India could also establish itself very credibly. So I think there's a strong, you know, almost an export interest there, which I think changes the internal dynamic a little bit. So it's not just about protecting domestic populations, which is important. So I think the e-commerce, the digital delivery side, I think is an interesting game changer in those discussions. On the broader question of qualifications and the like, here, I mean, I think we do need to ask, are there regional or standards, or you know, is there foreign training which we would accept as equivalent to domestic training? And I think, you know, let's just take an example. Do I really believe that the training of doctors in New Zealand and Australia are materially different? Probably not. And so it doesn't seem to me I don't see why there should be any impediment to properly qualified people working on both sides, both countries. And one could think a bit more broadly about this as well. Now, having said all that, there is an important development question that if one does have huge cross-border movement in medical personnel, there will be implications for countries which lose lots of medical personnel. And we've seen that in Europe, actually, with a lot of Polish doctors and nurses coming to Western Europe. So there's an important health issue there too. But I think thinking a little bit more openly about the medical standard necessary to deliver high quality care, rather than insisting that someone has studied in your own country, might be a way of relaxing some constraints. And it might also be a way of some countries developing comparative advantage in training medical professionals, right? And I think that's a potentially very interesting line of business as well.
Do you know, let me just jump in, and I realize we're out of time, but just one more thing to put on, and it's particularly mode one, it's that cross-border. And I mentioned the trade ministry and the health, obviously, but of course the big thing here, I mean, this is data, and it's cross-border data now. So you're going to have whether it's the Privacy Commission or the ministry that deals with that, and of course this is becoming a large issue. Even China's taking steps almost on a daily basis, including a company that was just caught up in this kind of scandal. Was a health service company who of course the government wants to prevent from transferring the health data of citizens abroad, so essentially preventing them from listing on the New York stock market. So we do have to look at these broader issues and not just kind of look at it in a from our own little silo.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you so much, Simon. I think we had a very, very productive session. We have come to the end. We had good comments from Vietnam, Philippines, and good participation. And I think we touched upon many issues that response to COVID pandemic requires many initiatives, not limited to, I would say, trade in goods. It would also encompass trade in services. It would also require facilitation measures. It would also require cooperation. It would require a lot of domestic policy tweaking. So I think in all, we had a very productive discussion, and I thank both the experts for their insightful presentations and all the participants for their attention and also questions. So thank you so much, and I now hand over the floor to the MC. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Darpan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Darpan Jain, for chairing the session, moderating the session. Thank you very much, Simon and Brian, for your presentation. Very much appreciated. It's very interesting, and also the comments, right? Just for your information, ESCAP is starting in collaboration with WHO a study that's going to be called From Lab to Jab, covering all the vaccine supply chain and related issues in Asia and the Pacific, to see whether and how vaccine production and distribution could be ramped up, possibly not during this COVID-19 pandemic, but during the next pandemic or health crisis. So, and the study results will be probably available in March next year. So looking forward to that, and your presentation will be very helpful in guiding us. So thank you very much. We will break now until 15:45. That's in about 7 minutes. So we will start again in 7 minutes on time for the fisheries, subsidies, and agriculture. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back, everyone, for this second substantive session today on fishery subsidies and agriculture. So let me invite my colleague, actually, Rajan Ratna, Senior Economic Affairs Officer from the ESCAP Sub-Regional Office for South and Southwest Asia, to moderate the session. He's based in New Delhi. Rajan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome for this session. Let me just first of all make some little announcement on how we will be conducting this this session. We have 1.5 hours, as you know, and what I will do is invite the two presenters who will be presenting, one on the fishery subsidy, another on agriculture. And then after that, I will invite a representative of government of Fiji who has opted for making a comment from the floor, and then we'll open the floor for discussions, and then the experts would present. Now, in this session, we are going to discuss two very important topics, and both these topics are indeed of great importance. A lot of debate, a lot of discussion, a lot of submission of papers and other things have happened. For the fisheries subsidies, I would, and that's the first presentation, which will be made by Dr. Radhika Kumar. She is an expert on this matter. She has extensively published and written on fisheries subsidies, and she is currently working in the Commonwealth Secretariat, London, as advisor. Infrastructure policy, trade, ocean and natural resources directorate. As you all know, fisheries subsidies, the negotiations have started in 2001. As per information, the last discussion was held on 15th of July, where 104 countries, including ministers and heads of delegations, participated. It appears that they have reached closer than before in terms of their discussions. It also is a very important topic given the Sustainable Development Goals. And as per the FAO report, 1/3 of the global fish stock are overfished, and around $35 billion government subsidy, which is 2/3 of which goes into the commercial fishing. And so this extra fishing, overfishing, is unsustainable, for which this discipline is being negotiated almost now 20 years. Yet there are issues relating to livelihood, issues relating to small island countries or developing countries where unorganized fishermen are there, who also have livelihood issues and food security are some of the challenges. And where the balance lies, how it comes. So there is a greater recognition that like other subsidies, fishery subsidy also could be unsustainable. But let's see what Radhika has to present. So Radhika, the floor is yours. You have got 15 minutes time to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, for the generous introduction. And also, I'd like to extend my appreciation for ESCAP for giving me this opportunity to present. My presentation today, basically, I will try to provide insights into the fishery subsidies negotiation, and it's already highlighted in the current discussions at the WTO, one of the key things has been for members to actually balance on how to extend special and differential treatment while also ensuring that the objectives of livelihood and sustainability is maintained. So with this, I will quickly go over my slides. I know I have 31 slides, but I will not touch on all the issues, all the areas rather, but on the important ones, and then provide some recommendations. And just at the outset, I'd just like to express a disclaimer that this is from my own personal capacity and not of the organization. So the outline of my presentation is as follows. I will basically discuss briefly on the economics of fisheries and management. This is important for member countries and interested stakeholders to understand, because this actually determines why countries are taking certain positions in the WTO. I will also briefly touch on the existing fisheries instruments and then go into some insights into the recent fisheries text of 2021. So in relation to the economics of fisheries resources, one needs to understand that there are basically three players in the fisheries resource extraction market. One are the holders of the fisheries resources. Basically, these are countries that have a large exclusive economic zones. So basically, they are the holders of the fisheries resources, and mostly these are developing countries, small states, and LDCs. Then we have the second group of players who are vessel owners, meaning these are countries that may not have a large EEZs, but they have very huge vessel capacity. And these countries have over time subsidized, and then they have reduced their subsidies, and now they have got the capacity. So these are the second players in the negotiations. Now we have the third group of players in the negotiations who are developing countries who might have some vessel capacity, and there are processes in the fishing sector, and they also rely on certain level of subsidies to compete in the market. So I've written a paper in Marine Policy on the game theory of fisheries subsidies negotiation, which basically tries to show when competition will be created in the subsidies negotiation, and when there will be instances where there could be oligopolistic or market dominance behavior, and when certain players would exit the market. So in terms of retention of subsidies, the access to fisheries resources basically is determined by the issuance of licenses, and these are basically in the hands of countries that have major exclusive economic zones. So if subsidy is retained, these countries are the price setters, because there's competition in the market from both the vessel holders and the processors of the fisheries, meaning between larger developed and developing countries, to demand for these licenses. And if subsidies are removed, then the two players in the market who are the larger vessel holders, who might now be benefiting still from non-specific subsidies, but the players who are maybe some developing countries who are depending on fishery subsidies have removed their subsidies, would not be able to compete fairly in the market. And then what will be created is that countries that are holders of fisheries resources will also lose out in terms of setting the fisheries licenses, terms and conditions. So this is basically trying to show the economics of the fisheries resource extraction sector. But then let's look at what is happening in the WTO context. So I will not go throughout the history, because I know most of you might know the history. And as mentioned by the chair, this has been ongoing since 20 years. Since 2001 in Doha, when this negotiation was launched, where initially fishery subsidies rules had to be clarified and improved. Then in 2005 came Hong Kong Ministerial Declaration. Then in 2016, the addition of SDG 14.6, and then discussions on the mandate, previous mandate plus SDG 14.6 has been ongoing until now. So what is the key issue in the fishery subsidies negotiations? Basically, we know that the WTO has a mandate to on trade and to discipline subsidies in relation to trade. But over time, there has been a linkage to management measures. And management measures are also not just, are not in the mandate of the WTO, but are governed by other organizations, both at the regional level and at the international level. So the difficulty comes where members are unable to now decide when management is included in the negotiations, then what would be the best scenario in terms of the STT to have a conclusion. So that's where basically most of the contention lies. On this slide, basically, I'm just trying to show that fishery subsidies is a small component in terms of resolving the entire issue, but there is a whole range of management issues that member countries need to also look at. And some of the issues are basically in other forums, and they are either in the form of guidelines which are non-binding and also in terms of binding commitments. So on this slide, I have listed the list of management issues in relation to fisheries and fishery subsidies. Two most important ones, UNCLOS and UN fish stock agreements. These are binding commitments, and these are legally enforced, and basically countries need to be careful when they are negotiating that such their commitments are not compromised in the fisheries subsidies negotiations. Then other agreements are basically non-binding or only applied to members that have actually signed on to the agreement. And on top of that, we have generally accepted standards, which are basically private standards. On the straight side, the focus on disciplines is on agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. So on this slide, again, I have listed most of the proposals since 2017. At the end of 2017, there was a consolidated document on TNRLW 274, which I would urge members to perhaps go and refer to, because the inspirations from this text is actually continuous, and it can be seen in the new chair's text. Though there's certain level of improvements, but if someone is new and they want to actually understand where each country's positions came from, then this text is a good basis for them to prepare for the upcoming MC12 negotiations. So looking at the analysis of the current text, the most recent text, basically it has got 12 articles: scope, definition, IUU, and then clause on IUU, overfish stock, overfishing and overcapacity. There's provisions for LDCs, technical assistance, capacity building, notification, transparency, and others. So now I'm just going to provide some insights on each of the articles. So first is basically on the scope and application or coverage of the article. Of course, the article on fishery subsidies in relation to the scope is based on the SCM agreement, and interestingly, it is limited to marine capture of fishing and fishing related activities at sea. It excludes aquaculture and inland fisheries. So it is an improvement from the 2017 scope, and it gives some level of comfort. Article 1.2 also covers non-specific subsidies, which is in one instance something which is good, and given the experiences of developing countries from agriculture negotiations when the non-specific subsidies were not really quite looked into. However, even for these, focus should be more on the carve-outs that need to be given to small fisher folks and others. So I will discuss this later in terms of the STT. Article 2 and the definitions are basically inspired from the general provisions, Article 1 of the Port State Measures Agreement. If you have time, please have a look at that. All these definitions basically are inspired from a management text, which is only valid on members that have actually signed onto the agreement. Now, just some observations. Basically, the definition of fish, of course, it means all species of living marine resources. Members might need to reflect, what does this mean? Is it fish or it is more than fish? Because if you look at all living marine resources, it can cover shellfish, sea turtles, and other marine mammals. Fishing activity is again related activities is limited to at sea, which is good because then the value chain issues are not caught in the mix. Also, the definition of vessels, as I've mentioned, it's basically a direct, I'd say, inheritance from the PSMA agreement. On this, members just need to be mindful. For some small states, they often use small vessels to offload fish from the mother fish that may not, mother ports, which ships which may not be able to anchor at a port. And this is sometimes a revenue generation activity for small states. So maybe further clarity is required in this regard as well in terms of the definitions. Now moving on to the prohibitions of IUU. Of course, the text states that subsidies are completely prohibited for IUU activities, and it is a general understanding that no country actually wants to entertain any IUU activities. However, if you look into the text in terms of the IUU determination, you will see the infiltration of management issues where the coastal state, the flag state, the port state, and the RFMOs are involved. Members need to also clearly see the implications in terms of being domestic vessels, or if they are foreign vessels and they are kind of flagging states. Currently, as the language is, this would have implication for foreign vessels that are using domestic flags and maybe small states. In this case, if a violation happens, then members need to reflect on how flag states in this case will prove the case, and also what would be their role. So in relation to recommendations for IUU, first of all, there needs to be capacity building and technical assistance given to flag state, port state, and coastal states, first and foremost, to develop their capacity before taking any commitments. And even though there is a level of SDT given, but it is only for transition period for 2 years, which is insufficient. Members also need to ensure that their unclosed rights over the 200 nautical miles of the EEZ is not compromised. And also members need to be provided with capacity to properly regulate and report. Then on prohibition of overfish stock, also again the text states that the subsidies are prohibited for overfish stock. However, if country wants to grant subsidy, what they need to do is basically provide evidence for stock rebuilding. And then to provide that evidence, there's a lot of conditions that countries need to fulfill. Again, in this case, for countries that do not have the capacity may never be able to do so. And therefore, the question then comes is what will happen to their small fisheries sector if they want to expand it in future? And in this case, simply if members are agreeing to this kind of language, then their special and differential treatment needs to be expanded to include these areas in terms of their SDT. And also again, though transition period is given, but this is not sufficient. And members need to realize that sustainability is about environment, social, and economics together.
Radhika, you have 5 more minutes.
Okay, sure. I'm concluding. So on overcapacity and overfishing, of course, you can read the entire slides, but again, the same provision is there in terms of the linkage to conservation and management measures. And again, if members need to seriously consider balancing the text, then they need to enhance their SDT. I will not go into other provisions in the interest of time, but I just want to quickly touch on Article 7, which is on technical assistance and capacity building. Though the article provides for a general language, but this is not enough because countries need to see that in other fisheries management agreements, whether binding or non-binding, there's special guidelines and provisions on special requirements of developing countries, so that when countries are taking such high level of management commitments, there's always a special and differential treatment in those texts. So I would urge countries to go back and look at that and basically expand on the SDT. And then I will finally conclude. Basically, fishery subsidies negotiations and SDG 14.6, as mentioned, needs to have a balance on economic, social, and environmental aspects. Also, the development dimension has to be maintained, and members need to also understand that special and differential treatment, even in the context of the WTO, it is not only limited to transition period, but there's a range of other elements involved in the SDT. So what could be done to expand the SDT as previously mentioned, depending on the level of commitments. And if members are committing to management side of things, then they need to expand their special and differential treatment in terms of IUU. For instance, SDT needs to be specific on proper reporting and regulating with monitoring, control, and surveillance, e-reporting assistance for overfish stock, proper stock assessment evaluations for overfishing and overcapacity, SDT on assessments, and also ensuring future development of the sector of small states and LDCs are not hampered. And whilst doing so, members need to also ensure that their rights under international agreements, in particular UNCLOS, is not compromised. And members also need to reflect whether in this fishery subsidies negotiation, they want to focus only on subsidies or they want to bring management measures into play. If so, then they need to also understand the implications of this negotiation vis-a-vis other negotiations in other forums and their future policy space. So these are some of the resources. You can have a look and in your spare time. And with this chair, thank you.
Thank you, Radhika, and sorry to rush, but I'm sure we'll have additional round of questions and some of the points which you think need to be highlighted. You will get an opportunity to highlight. Now let me go for the another session, another presentation. And this presentation is on agriculture to be made by Dr. Sachin Kumar Sharma. He's assistant professor in Center for WTO Studies, New Delhi. The center is Indian government think tank extensively working on the WTO negotiations, etc. So I'm sure when Sachin will speak, he will give you some mind of what Indian negotiators have been thinking on this agriculture. Agriculture is also one of the most contentious topics in the WTO. Came out in the Uruguay round and then in the Doha round. It's more complex also, unlike others, because it is not only market access in terms of reduction in tariffs, but there are issues relating to non-tariff, there are issues relating to domestic support, there are issues relating to export competition, and then the issues relating to special safeguard mechanism, which came subsequently. And there is a very wide divide on principles, on issues, and many of these mechanisms. I do remember when Pascal Lamy was DG, and it was July, August 2008, and the talks broke down at that moment of time out of 20 issues which he identified, and it was said one of the issues, 19th issue on which the talks broke down in 2008, was on the special safeguard mechanism. And the 20th item, which was not discussed, was definitely cotton. So these issues are really important. There is still a very wide divide among the countries. So without much ado, let me invite Sachin. Sachin, you have the floor and you have 15 minutes and your time starts now.
Thank you, Mr. Ratna and ESCAP for providing me this opportunity. I just share my screen. Okay. Just a minute. 1 minute. I hope it's visible. Just okay. I just continue. I will be very brief about what is happening in the agriculture negotiation at the WTO. Okay, there are 8 specific issues which are on the table in the chair text. One is domestic export, market access, export competition, special safeguard mechanism, PSH for food security, export restriction, cotton, and cross-cutting issue transparency. These are the 8 issues which are at present on the table. And members are discussing to have some kind of consensus on some of these issues at present. Now, let's go one by one. This is about chair text on the domestic export. But the chair has have given two alternative drafts on domestic sport. And one draft is prescriptive in nature, whereas in the another draft is more, there are more detailed modalities about how to discipline domestic sport. For this, what the key features of the key feature of the chair text is to cap and reduce the sum of trade distorting domestic that when members are negotiating, they are negotiating the flexibility or the entitlement, not the actual sport, but through entitlement, they are trying to discipline the domestic sport. So the objective of this chair text, especially on the domestic sport, is to cap and reduce the sum of trade distorting entitlement by half by 2030. Now, how the chair text is supposed to do is this, that all members need to calculate their TDS entitlement for a specific year, and then you add up that specific entitlement, and then there is some formula accordingly that to be reduced. And once that limit comes, this limit will be applicable for amber box sport, blue box, and development box. For audience, just I give the brief about what is the amber, blue, and the development box. Amber box are deemed to be very trade distorting sport, and it's include product specific and non-product specific sport. And each member have some minimum level of flexibility in the form of de minimis limit, where a developing country can provide up to 10% of value production as product specific sport. And in case of non-product specific, the limit is 10% of total value of agriculture production of that member. Blue box are the sport which are given for the production limiting program. And the other is the development box, which is a SNDT box for developing country, and it's come under Article 6.2, where the members can provide input subsidies to low income or resource poor farmers. Now, what the text say that once in the base year, the base TDS need to be calculated according to the entitlement of the member, and then the members need to undertake proportionate contribution to the size of their current entitlement. Now, and for this, the LDC member are exempted. It means whatever the cut members need to take is the non-LDC member, they need to take the cut. And there are specific provision about, they are mentioned about SNDT, green box provision, AMS entitlement, and transparency. Now, before I go into the analysis of this text, how it is going to impact the members to provide subsidy to the agriculture sector, let's see what is the background, what the different groups are demanding. For G33, ACP group, African groups, and many developing countries, what they are demanding, the elimination of final bound AMS entitlement. What is this AMS entitlement? This is AMS entitlement. Some of the selected members got during the Uruguay round of negotiation on the basis of higher level of trade distorting sport they had given in the base year. Whereas the majority of developing country and all LDC members have no AMS entitlement. What is the impact? The impact is this, that select members can provide huge level of support to their agriculture sector. In many of the crops, they have given more than 100% of value production as subsidy. For instance, EU in the past, they have given more than 177% of value production as a subsidy to the sugar sector. Similarly, many other countries also provided this kind of subsidy because of AMS entitlement. On the other hand, developing country subsidy level or support level has been capped at the de minimis level, that is 10% of value of production. So their demand is to eliminate the AMS entitlement. However, there is a counter narrative is coming in the last 3-4 years. Especially this narrative is built by some of the members of the Keynes group. What they are saying that global trade distorting sport entitlement is increasing very fast. Why it's increasing fast? Because of combined de minimis limit. This is the concept it's introduced. And what is the combined de minimis? Is the aggregate of de minimis, product specific de minimis entitlement for all the crops plus non-product specific sport de minimis entitlement. It means that for developing country, the de minimis combined de minimis entitlement is 20% of value of production. whereas for developed countries or members, it's a 10% of value of production. So it means for a given change in value of production, the entitlement to provide trade distorting support will grow for the developing country at a double rate than the developed members. This is the narrative has been developed. And second narrative is this: because the final bound EMS or AMS entitlement has been fixed in monetary terms, so it not change in monetary terms, whereas the combined de minimis entitlement is increasing over the years. So to control this, what is the concept? The concept of overall trade distorting limit has been introduced. In this, the limit would be the one specific overall limit would be established, and the sport under amber, blue, and Article 6.2 can't cross that specific limit. So this is the whole concept about why different countries and what are the approaches in disciplining the domestic sport. Now the chair tax is heavily drawn from the Keynes Group member proposal. Australia, New Zealand, Canada also presented. The Costa Rica also made the proposal regarding this. And this proposal is on fixed reference model approach, but it means that once you establish a TDS limit, it will not change in fixed monetary terms. For instance, if TDS limit for US is 100 billion, it will remain fixed for all the years. The other concept is floating reference model, where your limit is based on the value of production. As value of production change, the limit also change in fixed monetary terms. For this, how TDS limit has been defined based on the Costa Rica proposal is final bound EMS entitlement plus combined de minimis limit plus actual sport under blue and development box. Now, it is important to note that blue and development box are uncapped. So there, rather than taking the entitlement, the actual sport has been taken into the consideration. Once based on this, for all 64 members, this TDS limit is base TDS limit is determined, then non-LDC member has need to be take the proportionate cut. I did the analysis. We at the center did the analysis, and we try to see the project how this chair tax will going to impact by 2030 on across all 164 members of the WTO. Now, because due to de minimis combined de minimis entitlement, the global TDS entitlement will be doubled from 2018 to 2030. It means from 761 billion to it will become 1.4 trillion US dollar by 2030. And now, as the chair said, that the current global trade distorting entitlement need to be reduced. Now, if we take the reference period 2018, then the current global entitlement is 761, and it's to be reduced by half. It is 380, and only non-LDC member need to take a proportionate cut. LDC member not need to take any cut under the chair tax. So, we did the projection for year 2030 for all 164 members, and results are amazing, where it showed that the outcome of proportional reduction would require developing countries to take more reduction than developed members. For instance, reduction by 2030, China, India, Indonesia has to take more cut in monetary terms than the EU, US, and Japan. For instance, India need to undertake a cut of 182 billion in TDS entitlement, whereas USA is only 52 billion US dollar they need to undertake this cut. Further, once this TDS is established, if we take it as a percentage of VOP in 2030, what we found that TDS limit to flexibility to provide support to their farmer would be very high for Japan, Switzerland, Norway, and EU, then developing country, who are more or less capped at 3% of value of production by 2030. Another important point, the per farmer entitlement, TDS entitlement, that also we have projected. What we found that for Switzerland, how much per farmer support they can give through this chair tax is more than 21,000 US dollar, US 12,000 US dollar. But for China, India, and many LDC, it will be remain below 400 to 500 US dollar. The another general belief is that LDC is not going to be affected, because in chair tax clearly show written that LDC members are exempted from the reduction, but there is a catch, because how this discipline will be happen is based on the fixed monetary terms. So once in 2018 for Bangladesh, if this limit has been established, it will remain same for all the years. And by this approach, by 2030, all LDC member almost will lose more than 50% of their policy space to support their farmers. So these need to be considered while analyzing this chair text. And there are other concerns also there. But the chair text and the recent proposals, but they are giving the same treatment, similar treatment to combined de minimis and final bound AMS entitlement. It's totally wrong. Why? Because final bound AMS entitlement, US, EU can give more than 100-200% of value of production as a support to the product specific support. But even if you have high combined de minimis, developing country can't cross 10% of value of production. There, that filter again remain applicable. Second, the capping of TDS entitlement would further deepen the gap between developed and developing countries in per farmer support, as which I already have mentioned in the previous slide. Another issue is the market price support methodology. Under this, many of the developing countries are implementing price support through announcing the applied administered price. Now, under the agreement on agriculture, to calculate the market price support, the applied administered price need to be compared with the external reference price based on 1986-88. And due to this, the members, the developing members, product specific usually come highly inflated, totally away from the ground realities. So this is the one demand to change the ERP. This concern also has been ignored. Next is the capping of development box. This is the SNDT provision under the agreement on agriculture, where most of the developing country providing input subsidies to low income or poor farmers or investment subsidy to agriculture sector. And this TDS limit will make this box totally rendered ineffective, because this support will also subject to the TDS limit, and that TDS limit can't be crossed. The another issue is it also impact the permanent solution of Bali peace clause. Why? Because the support under the Bali peace clause or for the PSH purposes is need to be counted under the amber box. And if that is need to be counted, then it is also applicable, need to be considered for the TDS entitlement as well. Due to this, it has huge implication for the PSH as well. The another issue is the poor farmer would be left without safety net. As I showed that by 2030, most of the developing and LDC would not able to provide more than 3% of value of production. By 2030, it means the poor farmers would be left at the market forces without any safety net. The next is the market access. There are two specific component of the market access, the chair text. One is the transparency in tariff changes. One is the transparency in the tariff changes, but it deals with to address the unexpected increase in the applied duty, which can lead to uncertainty. And there the chair has given 4 alternative best practices where the members need to choose out of 4. It's about in route consignment to advance guidance on tariff changes or prior notice. These are some of the 4 main transparency related best practices there. Then there is also the second component about the tariff reduction, where the chair has suggested to revitalize the market access negotiation based on some of the principle like deeper cut in higher tariffs, then consider different elements of market access and other pillars and so on. So these are some of the market access related issue. Then on the
you got another 4 to 5 minutes time, Professor Sharma.
Yes, thank you. And on the PSH issue, the text will replace the Bali interim solution to the PS issue. And there is still ambiguity about the product coverage, whether it will cover the foodstuff or traditional staple crop. And developing countries are demanding about the foodstuff because it covers more products. Then about program coverage, the future programs of LDC would be covered. However, for developing country, they are subject to limit of 15% procurement limit. However, there's some in language, some ambiguity whether this 50% would be applicable for future or both future or existing program. Then another condition is that for the permanent solution, that public stock holding stock shall not be used for only for food security purposes and shall not be exported. The main another point is that this chair text has linked the permanent solution with agriculture reform program, and it would make it difficult for members to use the permanent solution. It may happen that PSH program may not be constituted to be compatible with the agriculture reform program. Then it would create a problem. Then another issue is on the export restriction, especially on export prohibition and restriction. There are two specific issues: exemption of World Food Program for non-commercial purposes. And the second is that if any member, if developing member, not exporting developing member, if they are imposing export restriction, then they need to provide prior notification or prior information on this in this regard. But there are some objection regarding that if a member give a prior notification before 30 days, then there are chances that market player will manipulate the market, and then they will try to exploit during the prior notice time and actual imposing of the export restriction. Then on the export competition, there are some transparency related issues there. On cotton, nothing substantial has happened. And this issue is very close to the C4 countries. And on SSM, G33 made a proposal, but here also not much progress has been happened till now. Thank you from my side. Yeah, this is the brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sachin. Thank you very much for your presentation, and both even Radhika and Sachin, and I'm sorry to rush you, but I know we'll have enough time to elaborate. And I would also urge you to look into the chat box, because there are certain questions for which you can prepare, and I will come back to those questions later on. But now let me give the floor to Ms. Karishma Narayan. She's a Deputy Director of Trade in the Ministry of Commerce, Trade, Tourism and Transport from Government of Fiji. So Ms. Narayan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. Bulavanaka, good afternoon and good evening to you all. Thank you, ESCAP, for organizing this consultation. For us, it's very timely. I'll just intervene briefly on the fisheries subsidies discussions. For Fiji, we are very committed to conclude the fisheries subsidies negotiations ahead of the 12th Ministerial Conference. We must ensure that the agreement on fisheries subsidies is balanced, meaningful, and it delivers on the SDG 14.6 mandate. For Fiji, we believe that the current revised chair's draft text does not have all the ingredients to conclude the agreement. The final agreement must require prompt and significant reductions in the level of subsidies provided by the largest subsidizers. Fiji entered negotiations for an agreement to reduce subsidies, not one that will micro-regulate our fisheries management and leave the bulk of subsidies in place. For Fiji and the rest of the Pacific Island countries, we have unique interests and challenges, and fish and fisheries are very important to us. Therefore, Fiji has highlighted that during the July ministerial meeting that we will only endorse an agreement that focuses on the sustainable development and the protection and preservation of our fisheries resources in a manner which is consistent with our development needs. The one-size-fits-for-all approach will not work for us, and small island developing states, the current chair's draft text, for us, it's imbalanced against our development and small-scale fishes. It will permanently prevent us sustainably developing our own resources by rewarding the existing distance water fishing fleets that have grown on the back of the billions of dollars of subsidies. However, Mr. Chairman, Fiji remains committed to a multilateral trading system, and we believe that it is paramount importance that all WTO members meet their responsibilities as we look forward to having a right balance of disciplines in fishery subsidies for the sake of our environment, our ocean, food security, and livelihoods of our people. I thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you. Okay, now I was just putting in the chat box. We have heard Ms. Narayan, and we have heard these two presenters, experts in their field. Now the floor is open. We still have some time. So if there is, yes, I see the hand raised by Uzbekistan. So Mr. Askar, you have the floor, please.
Yes, good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks, first of all, again, to organizers. This event is very important. Even though Uzbekistan is a double landlocked country and it has no direct access to the sea, but the issue relating to fishery subsidies is important for our country. And I just want to, and also would like to big thanks to our panelists who made a very good presentation, and we hope that ESCAP will put or will send their presentations to participants so that we can have digested very thoroughly, And I have just one question. I know our country is double landlocked country, and during the course of negotiations, there were a number of proposals from the LLDCs, I mean landlocked developing countries, who proposed, to put a special article or paragraph which has entailed the landlocked countries access to the sea. And I just want to know what are the perspectives of members, especially developing countries, who are especially participating and engaged in these negotiations of agreeing on this very important clause for us, I mean for LLDCs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, the delegate from Uzbekistan. Is there anybody else who has some questions or comments? Can raise your hand, please. Delegation from Uzbekistan, you can lower your hand. Thank you. Okay, while others wait to raise their hand and ask a question, may I first invite, let me change the order, Sachin. If you can see the chat box, there are a few comments which has come from Mr. Shomes. So, and there is one question also regarding Amber box, blue box, development box. But I think you have stated when you were making presentation. Okay, I see, 1 second, Mr. Govinder Bahadur Karki. Yes, please, you have the floor, sir.
I'm Govinder Karki. Yeah. Can I speak now?
Yes, please speak.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to raise one question. This question is very much related to Mr. Sachin Kumar Sharma from India. My question is that Nepal government is providing product-specific subsidies for exporter, like our main exportable product right now is tea, coffee, pasmina, Kashmiri, carpet, and so on. And this decision is a little bit debatable between professional and policymaker and politician, since we have been providing up to 5% of the export subsidy based on the export volume. So I want to listen from our Sachin Kumar Sharma from India that whether this kind of export subsidy can really can help to export the product in sustainable way. What is the experience of India and other developing countries? So I want to listen the experience from India and maybe from other developing and LDC countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Karki. Sachin, you have the floor first, and then I will give the floor to Radhika to answer to the question which has been raised. You have the floor, Sachin.
Okay. Thank you, Ratnaji. Okay, I'll go with the last question with Mr. Govinder. About export subsidy, especially on the agriculture goods, already a decision has been made in the Nairobi ministerial decision that export subsidy as a LDC member can provide up to 2030. They can provide export subsidy on agriculture goods, but especially because many of the countries and members developing an LDC member, they have not provided subsidy during their base period, during when they exceeded or when they joined the WTO. So, but they can provide under Article 9.4 marketing and transportation kind of export subsidy till 2030. For developing countries, 2023. Now the question whether it's sustainable or not is a lot of debate. There are a lot of debate on this issue, and even developing country like India, we are using this subsidy sometimes to export our goods, especially marketing and transportation goods. So further, there is a lot of debate whether it's sustained or not. Second question was about landlocked country, the specific thing, especially on the domestic sport. When we under the Doha round, there are different categories of members were there. SVE, land, LDC countries, there are different type of categories for and recently exceeded members in 2008 tax. But if we see the chair tax at present, the differentiate is the three broad category: developing, and LDC, nothing else. And already I told that even LDC, like country like Nepal, maybe in the text clearly it's shown that written that these Nepal would be exempted from reducing the subsidy, but because the methodology is fixed in monetary terms, so it means whatever subsidy or sport flexibility they have in 2018 or 2021, it will remain fixed for all the years. And that's what, when we did the projection, what we found that LDC country will lose more than 50% of their flexibility in future if they wanted to support your farmers. For example, in 2016, Nepal has started a price support program for the rice. They start announcing MSP. Whether they implement it or not, it's a different matter. But there would be a cap on this specific limit for LDCN. Okay. Then there is one question was on what is Amber, Blue, and Development Box. I again, just for clarification, I give Amber Box is deemed to be very trade distorting sport, and there is specific this is capped. You can't give unlimited sport under this Amber Box, and there are two type of category: product specific and non-product specific. Product specific like India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Zambia, Zimbabwe, they are providing MSP or price support policy for a specific product, and it will come under the Amber Box. Second is within Amber Box there is non-product specific. If a member provides support for the fertilizer subsidy, for irrigation facility, or irrigation electricity subsidy, then it would come under the non-product specific. There the limit is 10% of total value of agriculture production of that specific member. Now for the developing country, there is one more flexibility within the agreement on agriculture. Rather than notifying your input subsidy to low income or resource poor farmers under the non-product specific, they have the option to notify under development box, which is unlimited and uncapped. And in the chair tax, that this unlimited flexibility will go away. because due to the implementation of the TDS limit. The next question is about Sumesh Mathur. Has the base year has been changed? There are proposals for to change the base year, because currently the base year is for the founding members 1986-88. However, because due to this, there are inflated market price sport when we calculate it come. So G33 and many times we are raising this issue to change the ERP or consider inflation while calculating the product specific sport. However, nothing has been happened, whether it's benefit for India or not. Yes, for India, for developing country, for LDC is beneficial because it will give the more realistic picture about the sport level prevailing in a country. Then I think another question. Okay, there is one last question about by Sumesh Mathur. Any distortion, blue, red, or yellow subsidy reduce national or global welfare? Will negotiation go beyond reducing export subsidy? Export subsidy pillar has more or less has been their consensus is more or less is settled down, except on the export credit or export finances. However, the issue at present, which is the most burning issue, is about the domestic sport to agriculture. There are different discipline has been proposed over the years. However, each member, whether the member is LDC, developed or developing member, no country leaving their farmer at the mercy of market. They are implementing the programs according to their socio-economic situation. Maybe some program is good, compatible with the socio-economic situation of US, and the other is not with the compatible with the Nepal or India. So member needs some policy space, because whenever they, especially for the developing country where more than 45 to 50% population engage in agriculture and prevailing farm distress, their government need flexibility to support their farmers. From my side, I think these are some questions.
Sorry, Sachin, I hope, did you answer that question on the base year or reference year?
Yes,
for the
I did.
year?
I did
Okay.
it.
Thank you. Thank you. I missed out that. Okay, so now Radhika, you have the floor. There are two questions. One is there in, of course, it relates to India on the fisheries subsidy, which talks about what you think is India's position or how India will be affected. So your expertise is also required to answer that question, and definitely there was a comment from the floor. So maybe you can try to answer. And if you want to still highlight some points which were there in your presentation, but because of the paucity of time, I interrupted you. You can take the floor at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So I will just first of all start with what the distinguished delegate from Uzbekistan raised about LLDCs. And since all of you have access to the slides, in one of the slide on 26 on Article 11, there's a language on LLDCs. I think that's where the landlocked countries have put this language on final provisions, which states that nothing in this instrument shall be construed or applied in a manner which affects the rights of landlocked country members under public international law.
Sorry, which slide? Sorry, which slide?
It is slide 26, Article 11, final provisions, 11.1.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, yes. So basically what, and as mentioned by Sachin, in terms of the categorization of members, we have developed, developing, and LDCs. Now, having in the WTO, but having said that, whatever the proposals that the LDCs have put in this, in terms of the final provision, I've put a comment there that this is not, I mean, this is very important, and it's not just important for the LLDCs, but it could be also useful for all members, because as previously mentioned, the fishery subsidies negotiations, though member countries are trying to balance the sustainability side of things, but also the economics and the social aspect, the three elements make up the SDG goals, right? So whilst we are negotiating, we have to understand this, and that is where the special and differential treatment also kicks in. So if suppose whichever way the negotiations goes from this current text, and depending on different countries' views, which is of course their own prerogative, if members suppose link management measures in any way into the current fisheries subsidies negotiation and have any agreement, then they have to be very careful that their rights under international public international law is not compromised, and in particular, more specifically, their retention of their sovereign rights in the UNCLOS and the fish stock agreement, which is basically legally binding. And on the other hand, what the proposal of the landlocked countries have maybe proposed is also very important for all members, is that other provisions that are basically that has been inherited from other management guidelines into the fisheries subsidies, those provisions are non-binding outside the WTO. So once you bring it into this WTO context, it becomes legally binding. So if it becomes legally binding, then the one solution would be that developing countries need to seriously think of strengthening their special and differential treatment if they really need an outcome which is balanced and which has got a development dimension attached to it. So basically, it's like a rubber band. The more stronger the scope, the more stringent the conditions are on each of the articles, the more stronger the special and differential treatment should be, and it should not just be on the acceptance of just a transition period. Because management, if members go in the direction of accepting management linkages, then if you unravel even the management side of the fisheries economics, there's a lot of things involved, which is in terms of capacity and implementation. And I also saw one of the comments from, I think, Professor Somesh on India's position on fisheries subsidies. Basically, I cannot like state honestly, I cannot say what India's position is, but in terms of course, for developing countries, their position has always been on a development dimension perspective. Countries do want to ensure that there's conclusion in fisheries subsidies, but at the same time, there has to be balance in terms of protection of their sector. There should be policy space in which their sector can grow. I think there's also a another and some additions where one of the things maybe it would be better for me to also clarify is that when we talk about UNCLOS and when we talk about the ocean, there's 12 nautical miles, which is coastal states, then there's 200 nautical miles, which is exclusive economic zone, and then beyond 200 nautical miles is where there is high seas, right? So here, if countries are, what the provision is mostly saying is that in some of the cases, the territorial, there's carve-outs for territorial waters, but for 200 beyond territorial waters, if you want to take commitments, then of course you have to abide by certain conditions, and of course those conditions are stringent in nature. So you have to basically be very careful and look at that. And if suppose the conditions are stringent, then equally you need to ask for special and differential treatment equivalent to that stringent condition. And that is how you basically negotiate, right? And in terms of the use of technology, of course, I must say for proper reporting and proper regulating, and this is also the case in the Pacific, especially the very small island countries of the North Pacific, which are parties to the Nauru Agreement. I know most of those countries are already using some of these technologies like e-reporting, monitoring, control, and surveillance to monitor the seas to prevent illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So if you are going, if the negotiations are going in that direction, then yes, you can use technology, but then the basis is what will you use the technology for? If it's like technology to catch even more fish, then maybe that might be an issue. But if it's a technology to perhaps properly report and regulate, and that is the assistance you require, and the institutional and capacity building, then I think that could be, I mean, that should not be a problem. And that if you do that well, then you will solve the tragedy of commons problem as well. And I think yeah, I think I have answered Professor Somesh, but I've also given him my written response in the chat.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you very much. Now, again, let me go back to the floor. If anybody has any comment, any question, this is the time to raise your hand because we still have a couple of minutes. And if there is no, then I have a few questions which I would like to ask to them. But yeah, let me give some seconds to anybody has any question, you can raise the hand. So nobody. Okay, no problem. Thank you. Let me, as a moderator, also try to play. Oh, there is, yes. Chakradhar Jadhav. Yes, please.
Sir, thank you so much. And thank you, Radhika and Sachin sir, for a wonderful presentation. This is not a question actually. When we and Radhika started to work on these subsidies, we find that there is a lack of data on subsidies. The only OECD provides what kind of subsidies the government will give. But the major problem is that if we do not have data on what kind of fisheries subsidies we provide, and I think the designing policies in the WTO may lead, a huge effect on developing countries. So I think data need to be created in such a way that, especially for the India, we do not have data on subsidies. With my little knowledge, I don't know. This is the question that's why related to Somesh sir also. So how we can develop a data on fishery subsidies so that the type of subsidies and and the subsidies given to the different sectors within the fishery could be beneficial for the many policymakers. So that's what I want to know.
Thank you, Jadhav. Radhika, would you like to comment upon this?
Well, of course, I mean, I agree that there are issues in relation to data. And of course, the more data we get, the better it is. And there needs to be investment done in that. But having said that, I mean, given this is an area of research, maybe ESCAP and others can collaborate on and do like gather more data on subsidies for developing countries, and also for developed countries, we have OECD data. But at the same time, looking at the time span of MC12, which is like in few months, I would also, if members are interested to know, have some insights on fishery subsidies, what is granted, what is given. So there's few databases, of course, OECD, there's also the Sea Around Us, which gives some indication of what kind of subsidies that countries are providing. And also in my slide as reference, I've put an application which I collaborated with Oracle and developed. And if you open that application, you will see the vessel length of countries, how many there are, their gross tonnage, which countries are leading in those, because I think overcapacity and overfishing, though the text is there, but in terms of discussion on which countries are holding more vessels and which countries need to take deeper obligations and commitments is missing in the text. So that application might provide you with some insights, and also it gives you insights on in terms of the kinds of subsidies that is actually provided by major countries, and the kinds of subsidies that the major countries, some of the major countries have actually reduced to build capacity over time. So that would be some basis, but yeah, I'm not kind of saying that there's this is sufficient. We still need to gather a lot of data. Yeah.
Thank you, Radhika. I have two questions from you. You come from Fiji, you come from Pacific. You have a very extensive experience of working there. You also worked in Marshall Island, and then you represented Fiji as a deputy PR to WTO. I am just asking you one question, what my understanding has been. Most of these small island countries, especially in the Pacific, they do not have their own fishing vessel. So basically it's a registration, giving the flagship. So there are other countries who come get the licensing for the fishing and others. So the extent of the burden of subsidy on the national governments, especially in small island country which are in Pacific, to my perception, should not be an issue. Because if at all there are subsidies for the fishing, and as you elaborated, the text has changed. So now the inland fishing is beyond the purview of this discipline. It's only when you are going into the sea. But still many a times I hear about the balanced outcome or some opposition. So I just wanted to know what is the reason for some of the countries coming out with opposition. I can understand if they have their own fishing vessels and they are highly subsidizing, and it is fish is one of the exporting fish is one of the important contributors to their economy and the GDP. I can understand. In this situation, what is your perception? That is number one. Number two, I have been hearing, even I heard the previous presentations. We did discuss about the challenges. We understand this is the problem. Nobody talks about what is the balanced outcome. So given your expertise, I want to know, if I have to look at, if I simply want today, in your perception, okay, there are differences, there are developmental challenges, there are S&D related issues, but if you see that there is a compromise, and irrespective of the positions of the country, because I see, I have been a part of this process. Any outcome of negotiation is never an ideal document. It's the least imperfect situation which the countries try to come out with. So it will be not very ideally win-win, but it would be that I bear some cost, you bear this cost, and this cost is minimal. So in fisheries subsidies, where do you think that is the balance? This is a question, Sachin, I will also come to you in agriculture in asking where do you think the balance, but I have another question to you, which I will come subsequently. So Radhika, you have the floor.
Okay, so first of all, in the Pacific, for the small states, of course, the islands are different. But one of the key issues where in the Pacific, most of the Pacific countries, though they are small, but they are also, they have large ocean, right? So they have the major exclusive economic zones, like the biggest, some of them have the biggest in the world. So imagine the amount of resources they have, right? Secondly, some of these small states, they have vessels, but relatively less compared to, say, the bigger developed countries that have like mega amounts of vessels. But that does not stop these countries from thinking of their future fisheries policies in terms of expanding and domesticating their fishing industry. So if suppose these countries who are not major violators are now have to take a commitment which they have not violated for, what will happen to their development of the future fisheries subsidies? And also, future fisheries sector. Also globally, the demand for fish and fish products is rising, and it is going to rise. If I'm looking from a consumer perspective, people are moving more to the trend of vegan, to whatever those new trends are. And of course, the demand for fish and fish products will increase. And it's not just for food, it's for cosmetics and so many things, right? Omega-3, right? So all these resource, where is it? It is in the Pacific, most of in the oceans. And in the North Pacific, there's a group of countries. Some of them, unfortunately, they are not actually currently members of the WTO, but they are holders of the largest tuna supply in the world. And these are called parties to the Nauru Agreement. Now, these countries, they negotiate separate conservation and management measures in other regional forums like Western Central Pacific Tuna Commissions, right? So in those forums, they have their negotiating policy, negotiating rights to set their own terms and conditions. Now you bring all this into the fishery subsidies, and then the terms and conditions are set, what will they do in the other forums? And of course, another very sensitive issue is the rights on our UNCLOS. Though countries are saying carving out territorial waters, of course there needs to be a compromise. It's very sensitive issue, and that is a decision that has to be made by the highest level. At officials we can give advice, but it will be made at the highest level. And in terms of that, basically people need to remember, why was UNCLOS developed first? Why were small countries given 200 nautical miles rights? Because in those historical days, the imbalance existed. So to balance the developed and developing countries a bit, these rights were actually given in UNCLOS. Now, in the fisheries subsidies negotiations, if there's linkage to management, and if this is the way members want to go, and this is a decision, which is then no one can contest, it is individual country positions. But then we have to be mindful that the UNCLOS rights are not compromised. This is something. And of course, I know there's also concerns from some developed countries. They are very strong on sustainability. They want to protect the fisheries resources, which the small states have, which many coastal states have, which developing countries have. So in each of the 31 slides that I have given, that's why I was very elaborate. For each of the prohibitions on subsidies, there's another article which says, okay, if you want to grant subsidies, you follow ABCD conditions. Those ABCD conditions are basically, some of them are cut paste directly from the non-binding fisheries management text. So if suppose some countries want to legalize the non-binding fisheries text, which is then maybe then if members say, okay, yes, let's go this way, then for the developing countries, the best outcome is they have to legalize the special requirements of the developing countries, which is the special and differential treatment in those non-binding agreements, and bring it in the fishery subsidies. And then it will be a very balanced text. There will be win-win. No one will lose. Developed countries will have sustainability. Developing countries will have will also ensure their sustainability, but also at the same time, capacity building and technical assistance will be provided in such a way that they build their capacity. So what will happen in future is that they will not be, their sector will not be hampered in terms of not being able to expand. So if this is the cost, there can be a very simple outcome, if I'm saying it like that. And while analyzing the current chair's text, while even analyzing it, I could draft a second one for my own analysis, but this would be the best outcome. So
maybe good. You write a paper on how ideal
yes, I'm willing to collaborate with ESCAP on that, and we can do it in like 1 month.
Mia is laughing, and she's free. She can definitely do much more work.
Because honestly, when I read the text, I said I can now draft another one. But this is my own personal view. So yeah, but why not? We can do that before MC12.
No,
a ESCAP text.
Thank you. ESCAP cannot float the text, but yeah, we can be. Now let me come to Sachin and to agriculture. Sachin, I have one question which I was talking about balance. We know agriculture is very contentious, and definitely special and differential flexibilities we talk about. Sometimes these flexibilities are only theoretical. Like I'm aware of one case which was about the special safeguard. And the question of whether a special safeguard, when you are implying, should breach the Uruguay round tariff levels or not. And the question came that, over the last 30 years, if you have not breached those binding level commitments because of the SSG or SSM, do you really need to breach? That is a question. So, but that is also a matter of perception. But you made a very interesting point on the LDC, which was asked by Nepal, and then you talked about even a Bangladesh, stating therein that those LDCs have flexibility in terms of these support or subsidy or whatever it is, but it will have certain value attached to it, and they cannot go beyond that. My question goes beyond. And especially since I represent ESCAP's Office of South and Southwest Asia, which looks into South Asia. There are 4 LDCs here: Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal. And 3 LDCs are graduating. So Bhutan is graduating in 2024, Nepal and Bangladesh are graduating soon thereafter in 2027. Now, while in principle there is a flexibility, of course, whatever in agriculture, but on these numbers, when you are talking about, what do you think would be implication, or is there anything in the text which talks about if they graduate, what will happen to them? So that's one question which I would like to dwell upon. And then maybe what is your perception where a balance, of course, the very complex question, it's difficult to answer. But I mean, I want your frank opinion without saying, I know you can say, okay, no domestic support to be given, no flexibility, no carve out. But not that. You have been part of think tank. You have been suggesting government, and you have extensively presented in the WTO, you have written extensively on this. So, I mean, as an economist who has looked into both the world, theoretical part and the negotiation part, where do you think in agriculture could there be some balance, if at all? Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Ratna. Just okay. First, I go to the graduation, LDC graduation issue. Okay, but there are projections that some of the LDC country would graduate in near future, and now currently they are LDC, but in the near future they will be get the developing country status in the near future. Now, question arises whether there is specific provision related to these type of countries in the chair text. The answer is no. There's nothing in the chair text. So if you are LDC country, there is ambiguity there. They need more detail regarding this issue, because it may happen that as a LDC you are not taking a commitment, but once you graduate, maybe after 24 or 25, they say that you need to have some kind of you need to take commitment. But the real issue is more problematic, is that even if you don't take cut, even becoming a developing country, even your policy space would be massively cut due to this monetary limit. So that is the issue we need to take into account. And further, some of the LDC countries like Bangladesh, the Bangladesh provide price support for the rice. They provide. Similarly, Nepal, I remember in 2016 they announced whether they have implemented for the rice MSP type of policy or not. I'm not updated on that front. But the issue is that yes, these LDC country, their farmers are facing different level of constraints when they are doing the farming. Their farm level distress is there. Many farmers are poor, resource poor or low income poor farmers are there. There the government need to support them. And now the issue arises how they can do the support. Now, many of the countries, the agreement on agriculture provisions are maybe not compatible. For instance, green box subsidy may be not compatible with their socio-economic situation, or maybe they don't have much financial power to support their farmers. So on that issue, yes, all countries are supporting their farmers, and their government needs the flexibility. Whether they utilize this flexibility is up to them according to their socio-economic situation. It's up to them, the respective governments. But there need to be flexibility, because all developed members have this flexibility, and even developing countries are also giving or support their farmers through multiple programs. Like in India, we also do, in Pakistan, Indonesia, all countries, they are supporting their farmers, no in leaving them. Now, about the balance outcome, this is a very tricky question. But what I write about on the domestic support and subsidy, that's what I feel about it. It's not that I have two different positions. For instance, the balance outcome can be that we remove the asymmetries within the agreement on agriculture. Why some members can provide more than 100% of value of production to support for rice, for cotton, for sugar, and whereas the developing country or LDC can't cross 10% limit. Why this? Why there should be this asymmetries there? Now the second is this, that whatever the balance outcome, SNDT should remain an integral part of the outcome. Now, what happened, whatever the existing SNDT is already been attempted to dilute, like in the chair text, Article 6.2 is totally rendered ineffective by determining the TDS limit. It will make, it will leave no policy space for developing country to support their farmers. No. And frankly speaking, given the socio-economic situation, given the India's situation, I don't think that no country, even the developed country like US, would not be able to take that much cut, because it's too much. Now the point here, what's the developing country like G33, ACP group or African group, they are demanding that remove the first AMS entitlement. Once you remove the AMS entitlement, it will solve a lot of problem. It will solve the cotton problem as well. For example, in cotton, no country would be able to provide more than subsidy, more than de minimis limit, that is 5% or 10%. No country would be able to do. Then cotton problem would be, to a large extent, it will be solved. Now, on the other issue, when many countries are providing high level of product specific support, that issue will also be sorted out by elimination of this AMS entitlement. The point here is these are very contentious issues are there, where some members wanted too steep cut by ignoring the prevailing socio-economic situation of different countries, like Keynes group proposals are there. They're really very difficult for many countries, which I'm not giving on the official, but when I see their domestic support notification, their agriculture policy, even for many developed countries, it would be difficult to take that much of steep cut which the chair has given. I have calculated for all 164 members what would be their limit, all 164 members, and what will be their situation in 2030. Let's check with them, do the consultation, whether they would be ready to take that much of cut. You will get the idea that whether this chair tax will be a balanced outcome or not. From my side, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, Sachin, thank you. Now we are coming more close. I would have much liked to join this discussion and debate, but yeah, because of the paucity of the time and being a moderator, I cannot be arguing. But I won't summarize because these issues have been quite diverse, quite difficult and different. But indeed, thank you, both of you, for your very insightful thoughts and discussions and presentation. I must also thank all those who have participated, who have engaged into the discussion, posting messages in the chat box, as well as from Fiji, Uzbekistan, and Nepal, from bringing in. I also take this opportunity, of course, I don't want to do the same side goal, and I should have said, but I didn't. I wanted to thank Mia and Jan for their leadership for doing this, but that would have meant that I am praising my brother and sister. So I was a bit reluctant. I saved it till the end. And I think it was not by design, but by default. Many of you perhaps are not aware. Only a couple of months ago, I, Sachin, and Radhika have just, authored a book on Indian agriculture under the shadows of WTO and FTA, which has been published very recently. 3 of us are the editors of this book. So I don't know, Mia, whether was it that book that you made decide to put all 3 of us in the same panel, but having a different role, what is being prescribed in the book. Of course, Sachin has stuck to his position. But yes, it was really a very insightful discussion, and I am really hopeful that these countries, the Ministry of Trade officials and other stakeholders who have been participating would have benefited from this discussion. Definitely, even my knowledge has increased after listening to their presentations. So thank you. And Jan, you have the floor, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rajan, Radhika, and Sachin for chairing and for your excellent presentation. I mean, I think this this session is not as let's say media friendly as the first session, right, on trade and health. It's not such a hot topic. I mean, but the depth of the negotiation, because it's much more advanced, it has been discussed for so many years, right? So it's a lot more technical and things like that, right? But I think that's very important to get into the nitty-gritties like you did in a way, right? So thank you very much for that, and I hope the participant appreciated it. Let me ask Mia Mikik, our ArtNet advisor at large, right, to summarize and wrap up the day one very briefly, so we can all go home and rest. And then Mia will be moderating or emceeing the session tomorrow as well. So just for everybody to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, for giving me the floor. I have no intention to summarize the discussions during this afternoon, because they were, as Rajan pointed out, also diverse, but also so deep and rich that I would take another hour to just give them the basic summary. But I think what we have learned through from the opening remarks from our executive secretary, and then the remarks from Kazakhstan chairing the ministerial conference, it was supposed to host it, but at least they will be chairing it this year, and then also from the DG Annabelle from the WTO Secretariat, starting from their expose of the issues that need to be discussed prior to the actual holding of the ministerial conference 12 from November 30 to December 3 is really overwhelming, as Jan, you said, I think. And what ESCAP's role in this business is to actually provide a forum for countries to be able to understand all the complexities and all the issues in a way that is slightly distanced from the actual negotiating fora in Geneva, and that allow a little bit more open discussion, because we are not a negotiating forum, right? So whatever we are talking about here goes towards really finding a sort of solution to the problems that are remaining, and possibly reducing the distances between the positions of the countries once they understand the rationale or the reasons for the positions held by different countries. So I hope these solutions will not be the least costly denominators for the countries, or the minimum loss, as Rajan pointed out, but it will raise above that level with providing gains to the countries. I also want to actually point to one factor that goes along with to the true objective and the purpose of ESCAP. And this is that, from the few discussions that we had from the governments and researchers and experts today, you can see how actually technical the matters that are negotiated are, right? Journalists or media will try to paint the trade negotiations as a political gimmick or simply talks, right? But listening to what the actual issues are and how they can impact development or policy space and pursuant of sustainable development, you can easily realize how technical these are, how much expertise, data, and analytical work is required to provide proper evidence-based policy advice to negotiators, who can then try to push through with the solutions that will be providing countries means to stay on the trajectory towards sustainable development. So this is the role of ESCAP, where we tried to bring in the data, bring in the tools of analysis, bring in or put together researchers and analysts that they can actually then help in providing such evidence for policy making. And I think today's sessions demonstrate that as well as anything else that you can look at in terms of our work. So let me just finish with that and thank all the participants by providing comments, very rich comments in a chat box, and also, of course, our experts and moderators that have taken the effort and time to contribute to this joint initiative of ESCAP and our member states to actually help them close this very long path towards some deliverables in the ministerial in the WTO. Contrary to what we believe about gestation period for wine or fermentation for some things that they become better with the age, keeping unfinished business in WTO in terms of negotiations do not make them better or more tasty, and often they remain without any solutions. So the more effort and more knowledge we put in how to address these differences in positions of countries, I think we will get there somehow. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to seeing as many of you tomorrow as possible. It will be an exciting day. We will be starting the day with parallel sessions on so-called joint initiatives. These are as DG Annabelle Gonzalez mentioned, these are the sort of newer, some of these are newer areas of work for the WTO. We will be addressing 3 of them: electronic commerce, facilitation of investment for development, and small business or MSMEs. That will be in the first session. There will be parallel session. You can choose whichever session you want, and then you can go from one to the other if you want to hear more of the range of issues discussed. And then we will continue with the very important session. Again, this is one that hasn't, sort of matured enough for concrete deliverables, perhaps, but it is important because it's related to sustainable development. It is on trade and environment, or trade and climate change as well. And we are happy that we'll be able to also reflect on some more recent ESCAP work with its partners. And so Jan will be presenting in this session as well. So looking forward to all the discussions, and have a good rest of the day. Stay safe, stay well, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.